Welcome back to another hour of Chris Jansing Reports. Ahead for us on this Super Tuesday, feeling competitive in California. The key races that could decide control of the House in November, and the Senate seat that has Democrats trying to fend off a baseball great. Haley's last stand. Can Virginia voters help her stop a Trump Super Tuesday sweep and keep her in this race? We're traveling the Commonwealth to find out. Tracking the protest vote, how the president's handling of the war in Gaza could affect today's primary in Minnesota. And big clues for a battleground, why the race for governor in North Carolina could offer a preview of the presidential matchup. Our NBC News reporters are fanned out across the country as millions head to the polls in the largest day of voting outside of the general election. And we start in California, where high-stakes swing races could determine the balance of power in Congress. NBC's Gotti Schwartz is in Burbank for us. So what are you hearing there, Gotti?
Hey, Chris, yeah, we've actually moved down to downtown Los Angeles. You've got it behind us, if you can see. It's a big, big day for California politics, but not so big when it comes to turnout. That's something that we were expecting as we were going into primary day here. I'm going to take you inside here. It's going to get very dark because this is kind of a black box theater here, but come on in. This is where the polling location is. Most of the people that we've seen so far today have come in and they've dropped off their ballots. California does that incredible job of mailing most of those ballots out. But if you don't have one of those ballots, then this is where you can come and you can vote the day of the primary. But for the most part, we've been here about an hour. We've only seen about 3 people come in and talk about some of those races we were just talking about. Chris, we got to go back outside, so pardon me. But everybody in California is really talking about that Senate race for Dianne Feinstein's seat. That Senate race, the stakes could not be higher. We have 3 members of the House that have vacated their seats in order to run for Dianne Feinstein's seat. That is Adam Schiff, Katie Porter, as well as Barbara Lee. And that has become one of the most expensive races in U.S. history for the Senate. A lot of that money coming from Adam Schiff, who is the front runner. And there's a lot of speculation and a lot of accusations going around right now against Adam Schiff because of his attack ads against Steve Garvey, who is the Republican running in that race. For those that are unfamiliar with how California's primary system works, aside from the presidential primary, this is a jungle primary. That means that everybody's thrown together on a nonpartisan ballot, and the top 2, a lot of times in this deep blue state, it's 2 Democrats will go on to the next round, go on to the general election. In this case, we've seen that money tax Steve Garvey and say he is too conservative, that he voted for Trump. A lot of the calculus for insiders that he's doing.
3 candidates are really very strong. It was just really sort of a shot in the dark for me.
And then when you go further down the ballot, there's some competitive legislative primaries going on. Here in North Carolina, there's a new congressional map, the Republican legislature building in essentially more GOP-friendly seats. So a lot of open seats. There's also a competitive race that can help determine control of Congress once we get to November. So a lot of races here in North Carolina, as of course, still a lot of the focus is at the presidential level, Chris.
Shaquille Brewster, always good to see you. Thank you. In 60 seconds, he's the former baseball star disrupting the California Senate race. So why is the major question about Steve Garvey these days? Where is he? But first, how voters in North Carolina and Utah are feeling about a likely Biden-Trump rematch. Take a listen, including this first voter who explains why he has to vote Biden.
Whether I agree or disagree completely with what he may have done or may do in his office, he brings us a sense of calmness to the whole process.
In 2020, Biden or
Biden.
And 24?
I want neither.
I'm going to vote for Biden.
Talk to me about why.
It's kind of the lesser of 2 evils, in my opinion. Not that I would rather vote for either of them.
Where is Steve Garvey? At 75 years old, the rookie politician running as a Republican for California Senate has barely been seen. Almost no events, no discernible strategy, not a single paid TV ad. And yet, he's leading in a recent poll in a race where the two top finishers, regardless of party, will be on November's ballot. So how has he done it? Well, the easiest, most obvious answer is that the baseball legend has name recognition, something he talked about in a brief interview last night in the very friendly territory of Fox News.
I built teams, championship teams. We're going to do this again because at one time, California was the heartbeat of America, and it's not that now.
So here's the problem Garvey presents for Democrats. Even though California hasn't elected a Republican to statewide office in decades, the Secretary of State's office says GOP voter registration is now up. Garvey's presence on the ballot could energize Republican turnout enough to help in some down-ballot races, including congressional races, even if it remains a long shot for the Senate. I'm joined now by former Obama Deputy White House Press Secretary Bill Burton and former Republican Florida Congressman David Jolly is here with me. Great to have you here, guys. Bill, as I'm trying to figure out how you run a campaign in California successfully with no paid TV ads, I have to ask, what's the power of name recognition? I mean, look, former President Trump sure had a lot of it, and he wasn't taken all that seriously at first, but look where we are now.
Well, Steve Garvey is the beneficiary of what has been a pretty smart strategy by Adam Schiff to elevate his Steve Garvey's name ID with millions of dollars in TV advertising. Now, Katie Porter's doing the same thing with Eric Early, spending millions of dollars from her super PAC to try to crowd out Garvey from getting the top spot. But, you know, Schiff ran a strategy, and Steve Garvey is certainly benefiting from it, but there's no chance he wins in November.
Well, I mean, Katie Porter, as you probably know, David, is not happy about the Schiff strategy, but there are other people who are concerned. They're looking at the Secretary of State's website, which is showing Republican registration is up.
Sure.
Would it be a problem down ballot for Democrats?
Look, a high-profile Republican will help enthusiasm among California Republicans. There's no question about that. I think if you turn those numbers upside down, though, Schiff, Porter, and Lee have 70% of the vote. So California Democrats have every reason to feel assured that they're in a good spot. And Steve Garvey, you know, what I liken him to when you see that interview and you see somebody who brings a lot of profile, a lot of background, but little substance. I mean, look, I was a Steve Garvey baseball fan in the 70s and 80s. So many people were. It reminds me of the Tom Suozzi special election, where Republicans nominated someone with really an incredible profile on paper, but they kept her out of the press, out of the media, and they just relied on the negative partisanship to rule the day. Adam Schiff is relying on negative partisanship to have Garvey be one of the top two tonight, that if it's Schiff and Garvey, Adam Schiff ends up in the United States Senate.
You know, Bill, last night's interview on Fox with Steve Garvey was 3 questions. He spoke for less than 2 minutes, so let's just say it wasn't exactly a wide-ranging conversation. In January, when he was asked what the government is doing wrong, he said he'll find that out in the Senate. Does he really not know anything, or is that a strategy? Stick to the generalities, win support beyond the base, hope voters are looking for someone new and different.
I mean, look, former Congressman Jolly calling Steve Garvey a man of little substance is the most generous way to describe what Steve Garvey looked like in that interview. Look, I think he's not a particularly sophisticated politician and never really had a chance in this race, hasn't run much of a campaign. I don't think it's a strategy. I think that's just how Steve Garvey's showing up. But I would not take away from the strength of the Schiff campaign. Schiff was very smart in how he ran his campaign, ran a strategy, and it's worked. And it looks like it's going to help to make him a United States Senator from California.
But do you think he could hurt down ballot?
Well, look, as a partisan Democrat, don't love seeing the Republican registration grow in the rolls, but those numbers are actually pretty small if you take a look inside. So I don't know that it will be all that meaningful in those congressional races.
So the little that Garvey is actually out there, he is on topic. I think he's talking about immigration. He's talking about the economy. Here's a little more of that interview.
The people of California who have been suppressed by one party are saying they're mad. I said to them, let me fight crime in the streets for you. Let me try to get the homeless off the streets and get care for them. Let me help fight the border.
Do you have to, David, in this day and age, get specific? Is he okay just saying it's bad at the border, I'm going to fight it there?
Look, maybe he's going to help the California homeless by selling his memorabilia. Who knows? But what I will tell you, what you see in someone like that, and this is true of the Swazi race, there's a lot of message testing right now among the national parties going into November. And what they do know, and you see this in Garvey, the economy and the border are two issues Republicans want to run on, which is why I actually think Joe Biden needs to take control of those conversations. He actually has a good message on the economy if he leans into it. And he was the guy who just tried to lead this bipartisan border security bill.
But he tried to take a tour on Bidenomics and talk about his accomplishments, and it didn't get him anywhere.
Well, if you continue to lose on that issue, you're going to lose the election.
What do you think, Bill, real quick?
Totally agree. I think that President Biden has a story to tell on immigration, on crime, on homelessness, on the border, and he's got to be able to tell it. He hasn't spent very much money on the campaign side so far, has a huge spending advantage, so I think you'll probably see some of that coming out of the State of the Union.
All right, Bill and David, you're going to stick around, so thank you both very much. Coming up, the first election in Alabama after the major IVF ruling, where the judge behind it is now too old to run again. Well, here's what voters had to say when asked about whether age is a factor in 2024. If there's one overriding message today out of Alabama's IVF ruling, it's the importance of voting in state Supreme Court races. 5 of that state's 9 seats on the all-Republican Supreme Court are up for election, including the Chief Justice's seat. The current Chief Justice, Tom Parker, who cited Bible verses in his opinion in the IVF case, is too old under the state's constitution to run again. NBC's Dasha Burns is reporting from Montgomery, Alabama. How much is the IVF controversy looming over the Super Tuesday contest today, Dasha?
Well, it's certainly looming, Chris, but perhaps differently here in Alabama than it is across the country. Look, let's remember, this is a case that was ruled here in Alabama, the deep red religious South. And so as we've been talking to voters here, there are a lot of folks who agree with the Supreme Court decision, who do believe that embryos are children. There are also plenty that disagree. We've had a wide array of conversations with folks at the polls today. Take a listen to just some of what we heard. Do you think people who want to have children should have access to IVF?
Well, I don't know about that, because I believe in God. You put them when they want to. If they're supposed to have a baby, let God do the work.
So it's a tough spot for you.
Well, it is. It is. I mean, abortion and the whole thing, I do think they're children.
How important is that issue of sort of bodily autonomy, reproductive rights for you as you were voting today, but also as you're looking to vote in November?
It has priority. It doesn't have the highest priority, but it does, simply because people are making decisions without, I think, looking at the whole spectrum of what it will do to families.
Chris, one thing that I've been learning as I've been talking to voters about this is there's a bit of a disconnect with a lot of folks between this ruling by the Alabama State Supreme Court and what's happening at IVF clinics. Many clinics right now in Alabama on pause, so families are really stuck and scared and confused, but they're not necessarily connecting the two. I had a gentleman I talked to who very confidently said to me, yes, I agree with the Alabama Supreme Court ruling, but then also very confidently say, yes, I do think everyone should have access to IVF. So for Democrats who are trying to use this issue as a rallying cry to gather voters and galvanize voters ahead of November, they need to do a really good job of educating people to help connect the dots of how state Supreme Courts, how rulings like this can have an impact beyond just what's on the paper, right? And how it all does connect to the fall of Roe versus Wade, because not everyone is really understanding that as they go to the polls today, at least from the conversations I'm having, Chris.
Dasha Burns, thank you so much. Joining us now, Yasmin Raji, Executive Director of Swing Left, an organization that gets people to volunteer to swing various state houses, Congress, left. You're pushing for a Democratic trifecta, House, Senate, White House. You've come a long way in the years that you've been operating. How important is the fight over reproductive rights when you look at these overall?
Thank you so much for the great question, Chris. You know, when we survey our 1 million members and our over 500 volunteer-led groups around the country about what is motivating them to take historic early levels of action, survey after survey shows that reproductive freedom is their top issue. It's closely followed by a commitment to the fight for our democracy, given how much our democracy is under threat. But basically, our volunteer numbers skyrocketed in the days immediately following the Dobbs decision and then didn't ever come back down. They've just been growing and growing. And I think, you know, as your previous guest alluded to in terms of the national sentiment around even more extreme measures like the Alabama Supreme Court decision on IVF, those are all galvanizing our volunteers to knock on more doors, make more phone calls, write more letters, and do so early because of just how much is at stake this November. Our volunteers don't want to let a single day go by.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that because for all the issues that are motivating people, clearly reproductive rights is one of them. There is also something I saw described in one article as the meh electorate, that people are so tired. They're so just disgusted with the way things are. The question is, do they feel like they don't have a good choice, and will they stay home? So you're launching a new national voter campaign this week with a really old school technique, a letter writing campaign. I know this isn't the first time Swing Left has done something like this. What is it that you have found about a handwritten letter that you see can break through in this digital age, this age of so much noise in politics?
You know, we have found, and we measure each of these letter writing campaigns that are led by our affiliate, nonpartisan affiliate organization, Vote Forward. We measure the impact of these letters on turning out voters who may not be willing to vote or not motivated to vote for whatever reason that might be. And we've seen a really incredible impact of these letters on turning up the dial from all levels of the ballot. For the past presidential election, we wrote over 20 million letters to voters all around the country, and we saw a significant, measurable impact on turning out those voters. And we've also seen that impact down ballot. And so, you know, for us, what we're going to be looking at this cycle is not just how do we make sure that folks who, you know, especially what we're calling surge voters, voters who didn't vote in 2016 but have been turning out in elections ever since then, how do we make sure these folks who are anti-Trump get out to the polls to support Biden? But also, how do we make sure that the folks who are motivated maybe by a down ballot race, that we inform them through a handwritten letter? How do we make sure that those folks are also turning out and filling out their ballot through what we call the reverse coattails, motivated by the bottom of the ballot, but also helping to make sure that we are reelecting Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to the top of the ticket. And the last thing is, writing these letters is tremendously fun. Our volunteers don't just do it for the impact, even though that's first and foremost what gets them to sign up. They're able to write these letters from home. So if they are, you know, I myself, I've got a newborn baby who's 3.5 weeks old. Time is something that I don't have in great supply. Can write those letters when my baby and when my toddler are asleep for those short windows of sleep that we've got, or folks can write those letters in community. And so folks really, really enjoy this high impact tactic. And folks can sign up at votefwd.org to join our movement.
Let's see, write a letter, run a national grassroots organization, and have a young baby. Congratulations on that, Yasmin, and thanks for coming on the program. Appreciate it. We have some breaking news just coming in. Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema announcing she will not be running for re-election. Let me bring in NBC's Vaughn Hilliard. Vaughn, this was basically a three-way race, right? Ruben Gallego, Kari Lake. The latest poll I saw, Kyrsten Sinema was third. But tell me what's happening here.
Right. Just in the last couple of hours, our colleague Julie Sirkin on Capitol Hill was getting some rumblings. We were talking about the fact that Kyrsten Sinema could very well announce that she would not be seeking re-election for the U.S. Senate in 2024. And we, in a video just posted by the Arizona senator online, she confirmed that, in fact, she is going to step aside and not challenge the likes of Republican Kari Lake and Democrat Ruben Gallego. Of course, it was just a year ago that she changed her party affiliation to become an independent. She was going to be facing a Democratic intra-party challenge from Ruben Gallego, and instead became third party. But polling in the last months has showed her with support of just 15 to 25%, losing to Gallego and Kari Lake. Now, of course, it was Sinema who was on the front lines of pushing for that bipartisan border package here over the last several months. And that was, to our understanding, going to potentially be a key indicator of whether she would seek re-election or not. In this 3-minute video posted online by Sinema, it is quite telling, her words. I just want to read you part of it. She says, despite modernizing our infrastructure, ensuring clean water, delivering good jobs and safer communities, Americans still choose to retreat farther to their partisan corners. These solutions are considered failures because they are too much or not enough. It's all or nothing. Compromise is a dirty word. I believe in my approach, but it's not what Americans want right now. Of course, Sinema was on the front lines, Chris, of helping pass the CHIPS Act for semiconductor manufacturing. She was on the front lines for passing the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the bipartisan piece of gun safety legislation, and she led the charge to pass the Respect for Marriage Act. Senator Sinema, you know, I actually talked with her just 1 week before she entered the United States Congress as a House member back in 2012, and she told me at the time that she wanted to represent Arizona in an independent, bipartisan way. And you could say over the course of the last 10 years, she did just that. Of course, she met the ire of a great many Democrats around the country, refusing to pass filibuster reform that would have allowed for the protection of abortion around the country and to codify Roe v. Wade. She, of course, refused to banish the filibuster for the purposes of passing voting rights reforms, much to the chagrin of many Democrats, including Ruben Gallego, who was led to announce his own bid against her. But as a result, Kyrsten Sinema, who now, along with Joe Manchin, will not be returning to the U.S. Senate in 2025, those were the two Democrats who were on the front lines of actually negotiating with Republicans up on Capitol Hill. And it was Senator Sinema in this video who gave shout-outs to the likes of even Texas Senator John Cornyn, who you often saw alongside of her not only on Capitol Hill but also down on the border, who was instrumental in trying to help pass some of the border measures that she was seeking to produce. And so for Senator Sinema, she concluded her video by saying for 20 years she fought to represent Arizonans to the extent that she could. She was in the Arizona State Legislature for 10 years before that. It is quite a career that she put together between Arizona and her time in Washington, D.C. And the question here is clearly Senator Sinema implying that Americans are not looking for somebody like her, but they're looking for people that play to their partisan corners. And the question is, what could Senator Sinema do next beyond 2024? She is still very young, and there are many options in front of her, of course, Chris.
All right, stick with us. I want to bring in on the phone former Democratic Senator Claire McCaskill. For people who may be surprised by this, Claire, you are not among them. You said on your How to Win podcast, and it was just this past week, that it was obvious to you that Kyrsten Sinema was not running for re-election. Well, aren't you clever? And clearly you're not surprised. But what do you think's going on here? What was so obvious to you?
Well, what was obvious to me is that Kyrsten has the ability to raise a lot of money because there's a lot of folks in the country that appreciated her approach, which was always try to find middle ground, always find the compromises. I also realized that she had chartered a private plane with government money for her staff for a very expensive flight, and that didn't feel like to me somebody who was preparing for a re-election in a very tough state. And she hadn't started collecting signatures yet. You have to collect signatures to get on the ballot in Arizona. And her polling. So all of that added up to me is a fairly loud signal that she was going to pass on running for re-election. I do think I want to give her credit and give her props for how hard she worked to get compromises, whether it was gun legislation or infrastructure or a number of other pieces of legislation. She really did do what more people ought to do, and that is, you know, not make it perfect, but solve problems. And now there's going to be a very clear race between MAGA, Trump. I love him so much. He is the best, Kari Lake. versus someone who I think is more in line with most Arizonans. And I'm just crossing my fingers that Kyrsten Sinema would lend her very important endorsement to Ruben Gallego in that race.
I'm curious because, look, this was always going to be a really nasty three-way race, an extraordinarily expensive race. For a lot of people, one of the most key Senate races of the year. Now that it is one-on-one, is it, I don't know if the word is easier, but clearer race, Claire?
Well, it's a clearer contrast. And the people who were supporting Sinema have to do a real gut check and say, do they want a Trump acolyte? Is that what they really want? Somebody who is totally in on the ridiculous claims in Arizona about voter fraud and that really Trump had won and all of that nonsense. So I do think it's a contrast. And I do think her making this decision ought to be a little bit of a wake-up call to people like No Labels and RFK and some of these others that think somehow a third-party bid is good for our country right now. It is not. It makes it harder for, I think, the Democratic Party to prevail. And I think she saw the writing on the wall and realized she wasn't even going to be that happy if she came back because she wasn't going to be able to get things done because everybody's afraid of ever agreeing with the other side.
One of our great political analysts who saw the writing on the wall, Senator Claire McCaskill. The podcast that you need to listen to if you want to know this stuff before it happens is How to Win in 2024. Claire, thank you so much for calling in. We really appreciate it. Again, Kyrsten Sinema has decided not to run for re-election, clearing the way for a two-way race between Kari Lake and Ruben Gallego. Here's a little bit of the announcement she just posted on social media.
Compromise is a dirty word. We've arrived at that crossroad, and we chose anger and division. I believe in my approach, but it's not what America wants right now. I love Arizona, and I am so proud of what we've delivered. Because I choose civility, understanding, listening, working together to get stuff done, I will lead the Senate at the end of this year.
I want to bring back Bill Burton and the great former Florida congressman who served, right? With Kyrsten Sinema.
I served with Kyrsten.
Does this surprise you at all?
Look, I could have seen her go either way. Claire was exactly right. The money wasn't there. The polling wasn't there. She was facing some qualifying deadlines. And as a candidate, you do have to look at that. She has always been a remarkably independent person, though, which made me think maybe she'd give it a fight. The first openly bisexual member of Congress, someone who struggled with homelessness, a fascinating story and a testament today that if you stand in the middle of the road in politics, you get run over.
Well,
now,
what she said, compromise is a dirty word. Is that at the heart of what we're seeing today?
That could have been Mitt Romney giving that speech, Joe Manchin giving that speech, Rob Portman giving that speech, all people she gave a shout out to. Now, look, let's also recognize that for some voters, she is a lightning rod because she obstructed the Biden agenda in the early years. And if you're a strong Democratic voter, you said, wait, I thought Sinema was with us, and she wasn't all the time. And so you're glad to see her go. But you also want her in the camp, as Claire said, and I think Ruben Gallego's early statement has even said, look, I would love Kyrsten Sinema to join with me and the Democratic Party to defeat Kari Lake this November.
Let me read a little bit of that statement that just came out from Ruben Gallego. As we look ahead, Arizona is at a crossroads, protecting abortion access, tackling housing affordability, securing our water supply, defending our democracy. All of this and more is on the line. That's why Democrats, independents, and Republicans alike are coming together and rejecting Kari Lake and her dangerous positions. I welcome all Arizonans, including Senator Sinema, to join me in that mission. Do you think, Bill Burton, that if she's going to endorse, that Ruben Gallego is far more likely than Kari Lake? And look, if I'm looking at that most recent poll where Gallego leads 36, Kari Lake 30, Sinema 21, that is a huge portion, 21% of the vote that's going to go somewhere. Where's it going to go, Bill?
Well, hopefully the lion's share of that goes to Gallego. But I would point out, this does make the road easier for Gallego, but Arizona is still a very tough state. I'd also point out in Sinema's statement that she answered maybe two questions. one of whether or not she's running for re-election and one of whether or not she's running for president. When she said that this is something that America doesn't support, didn't sound like somebody who was looking to be a presidential candidate. But in Arizona, this definitely sets up a very clear fight between Kari Lake, who's for abortion bans, even in cases of rape and incest, who called January 6th a staged riot, and Ruben Gallego, you know, a progressive who is really going to be able to get some things done in Washington.
Yeah, Vaughn, let me bring you back in. I think in recent weeks, among the people who have endorsed Kari Lake are Rand Paul, Matt Gaetz, I think Joni Ernst, John Cornyn. What does this race look like now, Vaughn?
Right. The Republicans realize that this seat is going to be consequential to their efforts to hold on to the U.S. Senate. For Kari Lake, this is a candidate who I know that Republicans were looking for an alternative to after she lost to the gubernatorial race just 1 year ago. But Kari Lake's popularity within the Arizona Republican electorate is still high. And that is where there is one other opponent, Mark Lamb. He's the sheriff of Pinal County. He is running against Lake, but polling has indicated that she is the favorite here. There's a fundraiser with 17 senators that is taking place literally this Wednesday night in Washington, D.C. for Kari Lake. But in a head-to-head matchup, I think that this is really a testament of our times. If somebody had told me a few years ago that Congressman Ruben Gallego would have a shot to win the statewide race, I think I would ask you, who is he running against on the Republican side? And, well, Kari Lake is a good explanation of that. And polling shows right now, coming out of Arizona, that Ruben Gallego is up by several points over Kari Lake because she is, at this point in time, largely cemented her reputation here in the state. And when you're looking at Kyrsten Sinema and that 15 to 25% of support that she had galvanized, you know, it was Meghan McCain just 1 week ago who said she was on Team Kyrsten Sinema. And when you look at historically the state of Arizona, I go back to Doug Ducey's last win as Republican governor. He won by about 17 percentage points. And I think that that is part of that independent, even soft conservative, anti-Trump conservative part of the Arizona electorate that was consequential in getting Sinema her win in 2018, Mark Kelly his win in 2020 and 2022, and Joe Biden his win in 2020 in Arizona. And so far you have seen a Republican Party not move away from that tenor of politics on their side. And you've seen Jeff Flake, you saw John McCain, the likes of Doug Ducey leave the Republican Party, and potentially the consequences of a head-to-head matchup now that Senator Sinema is stepping aside is that they could very well lose a Senate race for the fourth time in a row.
All right, so David and Bill, I'm going to read a tweet to you. And in our closing of this big news that Kyrsten Sinema is not going to run for re-election, let me posit this and tell me what you think about it. And I'll start with you, David, since you served with her. This is Rick Wilson. Start the clock on when No Labels Org says Sinema will be their nominee. What do you think?
Again, Kyrsten Sinema is a bit of a wildcatter, so maybe she is going to entertain that. People will be saying, what about Nikki Haley, Kyrsten Sinema? Do you put that together? Something Claire said is very important, though. This is the wrong election cycle to run a minor party, third party, independent race for the White House. There is a majority of the country, over 40%, says, I don't want to be a part of either party. I want something new. But it is different to try to define that and build a party at the state level and run for president as an independent. That simply doesn't work. Kyrsten Sinema will soon learn that.
Quickly, Bill, I mean, this is somebody who is a marathoner, a triathlete. She is competitive. Any chance?
She's a fighter, make no mistake, but I think that she has some clues in her statement that suggest that she's not going to run for president.
Bill Burton, Vaughn Hilliard, thank you guys. David Jolly, please stick around. And coming up, today's not just about voters picking nominees. It's also about who the Republican Party wants to keep from winning, like a candidate who allegedly tried to hit someone with a car. We'll explain next on Chris Jansing Reports, only on MSNBC. Some national Republicans are working in overdrive to shut out what they see as troublemakers in their own party from getting on the ticket in November. A couple of examples of candidates Politico says they're trying to block right now. Quote, a woman who allegedly tried to hit her ex-husband with a car, a 30-year-old who marketed a conspiracy theory movie, and a pastor whose previous campaign was mired in election fraud. The main concern that those candidates would be part of the hard right House Freedom Caucus, the group that has been a proverbial thorn in the side of Republican leadership for years, forcing the resignation of John Boehner from the speakership, Kevin McCarthy, and opposing deals under the new Speaker Mike Johnson. And now there are two groups of GOP mega donors who have collectively spent $6 million to target those Republican candidates they see as problematic. Former Congressman David Jolly is back with us. And this is a party that backed George Santos till they didn't. But how much of a mess do you have to be to be targeted like this?
This all goes back to the failed red wave and the work of national Democrats to keep the margin so small in the House. Look, for a decade or more, John Boehner, Paul Ryan, others, Kevin McCarthy have tried to stop the election of these candidates. The difference is they've now taken control. The pirates have taken control of the ship. So this effort is just to stop the bleeding and then try to create a foundation where they can return the caucus to governing conservatives, governing MAGA, whatever you want to call them. However, this is the group that controls the House, that deposed of Kevin McCarthy, that put Mike Johnson in office. Kevin McCarthy has a lot of money to spend to make sure they don't get back, and you're seeing mega donors say, we don't want them back either.
Is the real problem now, they can do that because they have the speakership. The real concern is you don't take the House in November.
Oh, of course. Look, I think Speaker Hakeem Jeffries might be something we're saying come November 6th, because the House is controlled by MAGA, by the Freedom Caucus members. But this is the direction of the Republican Party. I mean, if you can look at the last 10 to 15 years from the emergence of the Tea Party to the foundation of the Freedom Caucus to now the fact that the Freedom Caucus is able to control the levers of governing. This is the direction, particularly under Donald Trump's America. So, look, I think if you're a reasonable governing person, Democrat, Republican, whatever, good for these mega donors for trying to keep it from going too quickly. But it's heading in the direction of these crazy candidates you just highlighted.
So very similarly, MSNBC political analyst Charlie Sykes wrote an op-ed piece in the Daily Beast, and here's part of what he wrote, quote, "The Republican voters don't want normal. And Trump's expected sweep will put an exclamation point on the GOP's full embrace of the chaos that will define the next year. Electability? All in all, they'd rather have the Trump show."
And maybe Joe Biden does, too. I mean, we are watching all the internal debate over Joe Biden and how he runs against Donald Trump and Republicans. Is it on the economy? Is it on his leadership on the recent border deal? Or is it simple normalcy versus chaos? Because, look, Nikki Haley's voters tonight are likely going to have to face a question. Do they stay with Republicans and Donald Trump, or do they go for the normal platform they've been endorsing? Do they continue to reject Trumpism? That is the coalition that Joe Biden might be betting on. Who is the Nikki Haley, Joe Biden voter? It's probably somebody that wants normal, not chaos.
We keep hearing about, and we only have less than a minute left, we keep hearing about the split between the people who vote in the primary, the base,
Sure.
and the general. Is there much of a distinction now? Yeah?
Well, what you see in November is what we call persuadables. They shouldn't be called moderates or independents. It's the 6 to 8% of the country whose vote is truly up for grabs. That 6 to 8% has been there for Democrats in 18, in 20, in 22, and will be there in 24 if Donald Trump reminds them why they want to be part of the Democratic coalition again this year.
David Jolly, who left the sunshine of Florida to come be with me on set, and I appreciate you. Thank you very much. A programming note, Rachel Maddow and team will have full analysis of Super Tuesday with Steve Kornacki at the big board, breaking down all the results. Our special coverage begins tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern, right here on MSNBC. And we do have, oh, look at that, all those reporters across the country taking the pulse of the people as Donald Trump and Joe Biden seem headed for a rematch. So stay tuned for that. And make sure to join Kyrsten Reports every weekday from 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern. Our Super Tuesday coverage continues with Katie Tur reports right after this short break.
Good to be with you. I'm Katie Tur. It is Super Tuesday, but there's big breaking news from a state that is not voting today, Arizona, where former Democratic Senator turned independent Kyrsten Sinema has just announced she is not running for re-election this year.
Compromise is a dirty word. We've arrived at that crossroad, and we chose anger and division. I believe in my approach, but it's not what America wants right now. I love Arizona, and I am so proud of what we've delivered. Because I choose civility, understanding, listening, working together to get stuff done, I will leave the Senate at the end of this year.
Joining us now is Punchbowl News co-founder and MSNBC political contributor Jake Sherman. So how much does this change the dynamics of the Senate going forward?
Drastically. Well, number one, Katie, there's a lot to unpack here. Number one, Sinema says she chooses compromise. She was part of a lot of compromises in the last 3 or 4 years, a variety of compromises, including the gun legislation. She worked on border stuff. I mean, she was part of every major compromise on Capitol Hill. So her tenure has proven actually that there is some, at least, appetite for compromise. That's number one. Number two, this becomes a two-way race between Kari Lake and Ruben Gallego, a much different dynamic, a head-to-head race between a Republican and a Democrat, where no independent's going to be siphoning off votes. That's number two. Number three, a real pickup opportunity for either party, I guess, since Sinema was an independent. But Republicans feel as though Kari Lake now has a real chance. Democrats feel like Ruben Gallego has it in the bag. So choose your adventure. And to be honest with you, Sinema, over the last couple of years, sided, along with Joe Manchin, with Republicans to save the filibuster. That's a simple fact. The filibuster, if there was another Democrat in that seat, and in West Virginia, perhaps, or another couple Democrats in the Senate, the filibuster might or might not be gone, might or might not be drastically changed. So the governing dynamics, the campaign and political dynamics have changed drastically.
Can we just talk about the filibuster for another moment?
Sure.
If Sinema's not in the Senate, and say it's a Republican-led Senate and Kari Lake is a senator, how good are the chances that the Republicans overturn the filibuster? Now that Mitch McConnell is gone, he had some fealty to it. And then if it's a Democrat-run Senate, I know that's a hard hill to climb right now because of the way the elections look across the state, the electoral map. If it's a Democrat and Ruben Gallego wins, does it also stand to reason that Democrats are going to overturn it?
Yeah, Katie, I think the basic fact is that almost no matter what, there's a decent chance that the filibuster will no longer, the legislative filibuster will no longer be in place. If Democrats win a couple of seats, have more than a 51-seat majority, have a couple of seats cushion, they could easily overturn the filibuster. I think that's a fair thing to surmise after the last couple of years in which we saw big roadblocks put up over pieces of legislation. And quite frankly, there's a strain of thought in the Senate Republican Conference that the first thing Senate Republicans will do in the post-Mitch McConnell era is get rid of the filibuster, change the filibuster drastically so they can pass their agenda. And I just want to make this clear, Katie, this cuts both ways. This will be extraordinarily difficult for Democrats to watch Republicans get rid of the filibuster and pass drastic limits on abortion, things like that, with a 51-seat majority. I mean, that's going to be the other side of the coin to the Democratic push to get rid of the filibuster.
And just to be clear, the filibuster is a 60-vote majority to pass legislation. This would knock it down to a simple majority, 51 votes, 50 plus the vice president, if you also have the presidency. Kari Lake is running for Senate in Arizona, now against solely Ruben Gallego. Here's what she says about this. As a journalist, I covered Sinema for many years. We may not agree on everything, but I know she shares my love of Arizona. Sinema had the courage to stand tall against the far left in defense of the filibuster, despite the overwhelming pressure from the radicals, she says, in her party, like Ruben Gallego. What sort of senator would Kari Lake be if she won Arizona?
I think she'd align herself with the hard line of the Senate Republican Conference, a coalition that's growing. And, Katie, we've been thinking and reporting a lot in the last couple of days since Mitch McConnell announced that he would no longer be the leader come November about the different pockets in the Senate Republican Conference. Been thinking and reporting a lot about those and what the makeup is. And still, I would say that the majority of Senate Republicans are still allies of Mitch McConnell and kind of old, to the extent they still exist, old school Republicans, traditional Republicans. But that caucus, that little pocket of hardline Senate Republicans is absolutely growing. And to be honest with you, it makes sense and it's smart that Kari Lake is trying to play for these Sinema voters who are
I guess in her mind, independents and would not vote for a progressive like Ruben Gallego, although he's not as progressive as some people might make him out to be. But the real question here, and I was just having a conversation with somebody about this the other day, is the old school McCain Republicans in Arizona, to the extent they still exist, do they vote for Kari Lake? They're probably not voting for Gallego. Do they stay home? And I think that's the ultimate question in Arizona in 2024.
Candidate equality was a big factor in the last round of voting in 2022, also in 2020. Mitch McConnell was adamant that the Republicans needed to choose better candidates. What is, I mean, I know Kari Lake is one thing, but the slate of candidates running for Senate right now, a lot of primaries today, how does it look in terms of candidate quality as defined by Mitch McConnell?
So a few thoughts here. Number one, Kari Lake, by the way, Katie, has been endorsed by the NRSC. She only narrowly lost the gubernatorial race. I mean, we have to keep that in mind. She very narrowly lost last time, so she's not, although she has made a boatload of controversial statements in her past, she was not a loser by that much last time. That's number one. Tomorrow night in Washington, basically the whole Senate Republican leadership infrastructure, I think Mitch McConnell's not involved, but are doing a fundraiser in D.C. for Kari Lake. She is getting the blessing of the Senate Republican infrastructure. And to be honest with you, Katie, the NRSC has changed since Rick Scott left. They are endorsing way more candidates. They are getting involved in primaries, getting behind the candidates that they want. They have a messy primary in Ohio. They have resolved their problems in Pennsylvania. I mean, it's really a mixed bag. And to be honest with you, Katie, it's not, while D.C. Republicans want to get involved, want to choose their candidates, want to make sure they have the best candidate in there, it doesn't always look good when the establishment's backing you. But I think they've done a much more forceful job this time around under Steve Daines.
All right, let's bring in our man who knows Arizona, Vaughn Hilliard, NBC News correspondent. Vaughn, talk to me about the contours of the race in Arizona with Kyrsten Sinema out.
Right. There was a lot of questions of whether she was going to run for the obvious reason that she was expected to pull a greater share of the vote from Ruben Gallego, the Democrat, versus Kari Lake. In a new poll that just came out just 2 weeks ago, Gallego had a 3-point advantage over Lake when it was a three-way race. But when you made it a two-way race, his advantage widened out to 10 percentage points. And in that polling, the unfavorability numbers, I think, are what are so stark. For Gallego, his unfavorability number was 26% of the general electorate. Compare that to Kari Lake, 49% of Arizona voters, according to that poll from Mike Nobles, view her in an unfavorable light here. And for Senator Sinema, the question was, would there be an opening for her? It was going to require her to get 43,000 signatures of Arizona independents by April 1st. And she hadn't even declared her candidacy to begin acquiring those signatures. At the same time, I just talked to somebody here literally 2 hours ago who was telling me about a fundraiser that Sinema was holding for her campaign just this Friday night in Phoenix, in which she was collecting checks. And so seemingly leaving the door open. This is somebody who entered Congress 10 years ago and wanted to have the chance to try to bridge the gap between Republicans and Democrats. She told me as such the week before she was moving into her U.S. House office. And largely along with her and Joe Manchin, she was at the forefront of working with Republicans. And so outside of the campaign and the question marks of whether Republicans can win her once Democrat-controlled U.S. Senate seat, that's the question. But then the second part of that is structurally, which Jake and our Capitol Hill team are much more measured to be able to respond to. But this for Kyrsten Sinema was a frustrating moment in which she acknowledged in this video that Americans, not just folks on Capitol Hill, but Americans are not looking for compromise, and instead they are retreating to their partisan corners and making the decision, instead of running this campaign and potentially handing the Senate seat to Republican Kari Lake, instead bowing out and leaving it up to her former Democratic ally, Ruben Gallego, to take it away.
Jake Sherman, Vaughn Hilliard, gentlemen, thank you very much for scrambling to get on this story for us. We appreciate it. Let's move on today to the weird but still very interesting Super Tuesday. Weird because the presidential nomination isn't exactly brimming with suspense. Donald Trump and Joe Biden are both cruising toward their nominations, and they're expected to get the lion's share of delegates across the 16 states that are voting today. It is interesting because we're also watching a string of consequential down-ballot races, ones that are shaped by the same issues likely to motivate voters in the general election. Reproductive rights, culture wars, and immigration. What contests in North Carolina, Texas, and California will tell us about November, and what the entire day is going to tell us about Nikki Haley. Not just whether she drops out, which she eventually will, but what might happen to her voters when she does. Do they move back to Donald Trump, or do they go to Joe Biden, or do they sit out altogether? Our reporters are fanned out across the country asking these voters that very question. So let us get some answers. Joining us now from Charleston, South Carolina, NBC News correspondent Ali Vitale, and in Greensboro, North Carolina, is NBC News correspondent Shaquille Brewster. So, Ali, what are you hearing?
Shaq and I so close yet so far, but I imagine the conversations that Shaq is having in North Carolina, at least if he's finding Nikki Haley supporters, probably sound similar to the ones that I was having in Texas with her last night. And I have to point out that last night in Fort Worth was the last publicly scheduled event for Nikki Haley. We don't expect to see her today. She's got no future public events on the calendar. All of that begs the question of what comes next after Super Tuesday. And it's a question that I asked her supporters, too. What do they want to see from her? And what happens if she drops out and endorses Donald Trump? Listen to some of their answers.
Oh, I would stick with the Republican Party, definitely.
Even if it's Trump?
Yes.
What if she drops out? Would you be disappointed if she endorsed Trump?
I don't really think she will. I think she'll just keep.
If she does, I'll vote Democrat.
No.
That's all there is to it.
We don't like Joe Biden. We don't want Donald Trump. But Nikki Haley is our best shot to beating Joe Biden, and the Republican Party has to see that.
I think we have two bad choices on the top of each ticket. She is beating, it will beat Biden in the general election. So keep going, girl.
Whether or not she's going to keep going, of course, is one of the key questions that we have. And look, in my conversations with both the candidate and the campaign, I've asked the question about Super Tuesday as an inflection point, Katie. It's clear that it is one. But for Haley, she says she's going to stay in this race for as long as she's competitive. That's vague. And the answers that I get from her senior staff are similarly vague. They say she's got leadership slates set up in states that come after Super Tuesday. They're talking about Georgia next week. They're talking about Louisiana 2 weeks after that. That brings them to the end of March. And so I do think that tonight is a question of if now is the time or if they keep stretching this out until Trump officially locks up the nomination. But certainly a clean sweep for Trump on Super Tuesday makes even the most narrow chances for Nikki Haley that much more near non-existent.
All right, Shaq Brewster, talk to me about what voters in North Carolina are telling you.
Well, Katie, every voter that I've talked to say they understand the uphill battle that Nikki Haley is facing in this primary. For some, that's actually driving them to come out to the polls. One lady told me that it's because of how Nikki Haley has weathered the attacks against her in recent weeks. That is why she decided to vote for Nikki Haley in this primary. And that's notable here in North Carolina because she doesn't need to win this contest in order to accumulate some of the delegates as long as she hits that 20% threshold. So I want you to listen to what some folks have been telling me this morning, both people who say they're supporting her and people who said they just can't vote for her. Why Nikki Haley?
Two reasons. One, I think she would do a very good job. And two, I think Donald Trump is a threat to the well-being of our country.
All a woman's good for in my book is having babies and taking care of the house, but that's the old thing, you know. But I'm old school.
So you never even considered her?
No.
Mainly because she's a woman?
Because she's female.
You're going to vote for Biden in the primary. Does he have a lock on your vote for the general election if it's Donald Trump?
If it's Donald Trump, I do, yeah.
Nikki Haley is irrelevant.
Why irrelevant?
Because it's obvious that she's just there representing the rhino part of the Republican Party.
And I do just have to point out, Katie, that misogynistic comment that you heard earlier in that bite, that's a similar comment that I've heard in other states from both men and women in this primary. Ali will tell you about how Nikki Haley tries to stay away from using gender in her campaign. But you see, for some voters, that is a clear reason why they're not willing to support her, even if they're not usually willing to say that on camera.
Yeah, that was surprising. Shaq Brewster, Ali Vitale, one more thing. Let's play a little bit of sound from voters talking about the issues that matter to them. Let's listen.
What's going to happen to this country in November was the prime reason that I'm here today. I'm vehemently disturbed with the choices that we have, and wish for this country to have better.
The economy. Yeah.
Why is that the biggest issue for you?
Just because times are tough right now. I'm working 2 jobs and trying to keep things going, and you know, everything's expensive.
What issues
Trump. Vote for Trump. Save America. Immigration. Financial. The things in the store are getting so expensive, and I guess we've seen better days, is what I'll say.
You think so?
I bet. I'm 88. I've seen a lot of days, but I've seen much better days than we have right now.
All right, Ali Vitale, Shaq Brewster, thank you very much. Joining us now, staff writer for The Atlantic and MSNBC political contributor Mark Leibovich. So, Mark, tell me something smart about what's happening right now.
Something smart. Well, let's see. I do think that clearly you see some dissatisfaction with the choices at the top of the ticket, or people perceived to be at the top of the ticket. I mean, I do think people sound more strategic in some ways. I mean, not the crude sort of misogynistic strategic, but the strategic in terms of helping Nikki Haley out. They think that it actually does make a statement that could, perpetuate a resistance to Donald Trump. But no, look, I mean, I think the most interesting part of this is what Nikki Haley will do at the close of business today. She, as I guess Ali, or I guess it was Ali who said before that she doesn't have any events scheduled. We're going to see what that means. I mean, we're going to see if she's actually sort of planned all along to get out tonight. And then if she does get out, is she going to, couple this with an endorsement of Trump, which I think at this point would certainly be quite dispiriting to a lot of her supporters. I mean, I think certainly when you talk to people at her events, there's a sense that look, she's gone not so much to a point of no return, because politicians can be very nimble. But she certainly found a sharper voice against Trump in recent days since the voting started. And I think it would be hard for her at this point to reverse that.
What happens to her? Well, yeah, that worked for me. What happens to her voters? I mean, we just heard a lot of sound from Ali and from Shaq about where they might go. There is a question. If she's getting 30% of the vote or so in each of these primaries, that's a big chunk. And is it safe to say that just because they're voting in a Republican primary that they're going to show up for Donald Trump?
It's not, if you believe what they've been telling exit pollers. I mean, there's been a pretty decisive margin of Haley voters in each primary so far that says that they do not plan to vote for Donald Trump, and some even say they'll vote for Joe Biden in November or will just stay home. I mean, I think the other side of this is that a lot of them are probably Democrats and independents were going to support Biden anyway, and they just sort of took the opportunity of a crossover primary to register a protest vote for Trump because they could. But no, I mean, I think that they're a real wild card come November, and I don't think Trump has any expectation or should have any expectation that he's going to get the same numbers among Republican primary voters that he did in 2020, when it seemed like there was much more universal and unchallenged support for him.
What do you make of this New York Times polling that shows that Americans have a much rosier view of Donald Trump than they did? I know people are talking about the sample size. That's what polls have. That's a pretty standard sample size for a lot of polls. And it's randomized. Yeah. So what do you make of this idea that is it just that Donald Trump's been out of office for 3 years, going on 4 years? And
maybe, but I wouldn't underestimate, it's not so much the dissatisfaction with Biden that he's old. I mean, people obviously think he's quite old or too old to be running again. I mean, that's been borne out by the numbers pretty consistently for the last few years. I think what it reflects also, and this is not talked about as much, is a level of anger maybe at Biden that he's actually putting the country and putting the Democratic Party through this again. I mean, I think there was an expectation, and it was unstated to some degree, but, you know, he did sort of run in 2020 as a bridge candidate, as the, you know, someone who was going to eventually give way to the next generation. And when he said this, I mean, Gretchen Whitmer and Cory Booker and I think Kamala Harris was behind him. So there was, I think, in some ways, an expectation that this was a kind of a one-time stopgap measure. And I think that's reflected in his sort of persistently bad numbers. But ultimately, I mean, I think what Biden's people and what the White House has been banking on is that once there is a clarity between the two choices, once people focus on Trump v. Biden, it will reflect really well on the president, and he will ultimately win over the supporters that supported him again in 2020.
Certainly hoping so. That's what they're hoping, at least. Mark Leibovich, Mark, thank you very much. And still ahead, from Dobbs to Alabama's IVF ruling, what role reproductive rights will play in today's election? There's an interesting race in Alabama that we'll bring you. And he was president a short 3 years ago and left office with historically low approval numbers. But Donald Trump, as we've been talking about, is currently leading President Biden in nearly every poll. It's close, but he is leading. Do Americans have what the New York Times is calling collective amnesia about the former president? We're going to explain. Plus, what might have opened the door to another January 6th crisis from yesterday's Supreme Court ruling? And as we go to break, a live look at voters casting their ballots in Montpelier, Vermont. We're back in 60 seconds.
Because our country's a mess. It was in much better shape 4 years ago, and if we don't turn it around, we're in big trouble.
When did you make your decision?
I made my decision 8 years ago.
Remember when Donald Trump tried to buy Greenland, the country, or when he suggested nuking hurricanes, or injecting yourself with bleach to kill COVID, or when he said he doesn't exercise because bodies are like batteries with a finite amount of energy, or when he threw when he threw paper towels at the people of Puerto Rico, or when he was impeached twice, or when he revealed secret Israeli intelligence to the Russians in the Oval Office, or when he separated migrant children from their parents, or when he refused to concede the election. If you don't remember all of that, you're not alone. The New York Times calls it a case of collective amnesia, helping to explain why Donald Trump's approval rating has gone up since he left office. Joining us now, former chief spokesperson for Vice President Harris and MSNBC co-host of The Weekend, Simone Sanders Townsend, and former Republican Congressman Charlie Dent. All right, Charlie, since you're the odd one out, not at the table, I'll begin with you. What is this collective amnesia? Do you agree with this idea?
Yeah, to a certain extent. People have short memories. They remember what they want to remember. They're focused on the present more than they are on the past, and frankly, that's the role of a campaign. In this case, the Biden campaign is to remind people of all the things that Donald Trump did while he was in office that you just rattled off a few moments ago. Again, people forget, and I think that's a big part of it. And also, we should remember that a lot of people look at this election as a referendum on the incumbent president, that is Joe Biden. Of course, Joe Biden will try to make this election a choice or perhaps a referendum on Donald Trump. But a lot of people are looking at this election in terms of what's Joe Biden done for me, not so much about Donald Trump.
What's he done for me lately, you might say?
Yes, in my Janet Jackson voice. Look, I think Charlie is right that people have short memories, right? Like, that is why polling, for example, right, this early out from a general election, I think it doesn't tell us much. It's a snapshot. It gives us some indications, but what you see over the summer, especially into September, when people are paying attention right before they start voting, that's more of a general indicator of, okay, this is what the people are going to do. So, yeah, I do, though, think this is a choice election because Donald Trump is not a stranger to the American people, and neither is President Biden, right? And so the choice is between the two. Now, there's some third-party options, but at the end of the day, no third party is going to get 270. So the campaign will have to do for the Biden campaign, they'll have to do a really good job of drawing that contrast as it becomes clear so that voters are very aware that Donald Trump is the other choice here. There's nothing else.
I know it's Super Tuesday. It's usually a pretty big deal. Not such a big deal this year because we are in this weird two-incumbent race, and they both look like they're going to lock it up. But are there issues or are there margins that the White House might be watching for tonight?
Well, look, I think the White House and everyone should definitely be watching what happens in Texas, right? What happens in Alabama? I know you're going to talk about it later, but the IVF ruling, that is on the minds of voters right now as they're going to the polls in Alabama, and what state legislators, Republican state legislators in Alabama, did not do when it came to correcting the legislation. They didn't answer the question of, is an embryo an unborn child? Okay,
Yeah.
so that is something still on the table. I also think looking at what happens in races such as California. Now, we won't know the details for some days, maybe, given how California votes.
They're not very good at counting the
You
votes.
know, it's a thing out there. In North Carolina. So some of these, and these are all places that are going to make a difference and matter when it comes to places or issues that are going to make a difference and matter when it comes to November 2024.
Charlie, what about the Republican side of things?
Well, what I'm looking for is to see what the margin is between Donald Trump and Nikki Haley. As Mark Levovich just pointed out in your previous segment, there are a lot of Republicans out there who are voting for Nikki Haley who have no intention of supporting Donald Trump in the fall. And that, I think, is a really big problem for the Trump campaign. Yeah, they have the MAGA base, but the Republican Party is still divided. It's not evenly divided, but it is divided, and Trump needs to win 90% plus. Of course, Joe Biden has his problems, too, with lack of enthusiasm on the Democratic side, but this is a real problem for the Trump campaign. They might not want to admit it, and so I just want to see if Nikki Haley exceeds her expectations, if she continues to hang around as an alternative in the event Trump is, for whatever reasons, unable to become the nominee for criminal matters or for other reasons.
So we saw an incredible level of turnout in 2020, the most votes ever cast in a presidential election, the most for the Republican and the most for the Democrat. Joe Biden had more than Donald Trump did. Are you expecting the same level of turnout? I mean, it was such an acute moment. We were in the middle of the pandemic. Everything seemed scary and crazy. Donald Trump, had been president for 4 years. Democrats were hugely motivated, as were some Republican voters. Are you expecting that level of enthusiasm in 2024?
I absolutely. I mean,
really?
Since then, we've seen a midterm election where voters came out in droves in spaces and places all across the country to vote for their rights and vote for their freedoms. Everywhere that abortion has been on the ballot, it has won. That's why you see Democrats and aligned campaigns moving to put abortion on the ballot in places like Florida, in places like Arizona, because one, I think there's real dangers there, depending on, especially in Arizona. I mean, Arizona was a place that was close in 2024 for the presidential. It was close when it come in 2020 for the presidential. It was close in this most recent governor's race. It is a battleground, and I don't think you want to leave your rights up to whoever might be in the governor's mansion or the state legislature. So I do think people are going to come out. Wisconsin, Janet Protasewicz, the judge that was elected in 2023
to the Supreme Court.
That was because young people, women, some even moderate Democrats, even some not so conservative Republicans, they came out and they voted for their rights.
Let's talk about another state Supreme Court. Simone Sanders, thank you very much. Charlie Dent, thank you as well. We're going to talk about the Supreme Court in Alabama. It decided that embryos are children, as you remember. The state's Chief Justice, Tom Parker, cited verses from the Bible and Christian theologians in his concurring opinion, raising a lot of eyebrows. Now the voters of Alabama will get a chance to vote on that decision, deciding who will replace him as Chief Justice.
The Supreme Court got it wrong, though.
You believe the Supreme Court, the embryo decision? Why do you think they got it wrong?
Because they said embryos are humans. Well, how in the world can you freeze humans? You can't freeze me and me come back. I'm a human.
That is a great point. Joining us now from Montgomery, Alabama, NBC News correspondent Dasha Burns. Dasha, it's good to have you. So this is a primary, and there are two, I guess, Republicans who are running right now against each other. One is a justice who's currently sitting on the court, also agreed that embryos are children in that ruling. Another one is a state senator. Whoever wins that is going to face off against a Democrat. Does the Democrat actually have a chance come November, given this ruling?
Katie, this is Alabama, so I would say likely not. Look, this is a state where People are religious. People are red in their political beliefs. And look, as we've been talking to folks at the polls here, there are a lot of people I talk to who agree with the Supreme Court decision. When I ask if they agree, they say yes. I ask them if they believe embryos are children, they'll say yes. That gentleman there was an exception and realized, yeah, he wouldn't do so well if he were frozen. But a lot of people do believe that life begins at conception. I want you to hear some of our conversations because I also have a caveat to that point. Take a listen.
I'm kind of iffy about that. I don't know. I'll leave it to the ones that are higher up than I am to make the decision about that. But I'm very protective of embryos.
I don't know about that because I believe in God. You put them where they want to. If they're supposed to have a baby, let God do the work.
I think women or families should have control of their lives and their bodies, women in particular. I think a lot of people making those decisions have not considered the whole realm of why people want to go through all of that expense, heartache to have children. And because they don't understand that, they're interfering with people's lives and happiness.
So here is the caveat. When I ask a lot of these same people, do they believe that women and families should have access to IVF? A lot of people say yes. I had one gentleman that very confidently said he agreed with the Alabama Supreme Court, and then the next breath also said, yes, he very much believes in IVF access. And this is the challenge for Democrats because, yes, this is absolutely an issue that can drive voters to the polls and that can pull over swing voters, Democrats, moderate Republicans. But it is a complicated issue, and there isn't a clear line for a lot of folks between the state Supreme Court ruling embryos are children and this impact on IVF clinics, and even the fall of Roe versus Wade and how it opened the door to so much of this. So Democrats need to really do a lot of work to make sure that people understand how all of these things are connected. They cannot take that for granted because a lot of people will agree with IVF, even with abortion to a certain point, but they have to understand how all of this works in concert and how their choices at the ballot box really do impact that.
This is a much more complicated issue, not as cut and dry as do you believe in abortion. Dasha Burns,
right.
that unless you're going through it, then you understand it pretty well. Dasha Burns, Dasha, thank you very much. Coming up, with their ruling that only Congress can kick a candidate off the ballot, did the Supreme Court just open the door to another January 6th? Plus, the role Hamas now says the U.S. needs to play in negotiating a ceasefire with the holy month of Ramadan fast approaching. But as we go to break, what voters are saying about the war in Gaza.
I think each side has taken actions that are wrong, both Israel and Hamas, Palestine.
I don't think there is an easy solution to that. I'm happier that he's now pushing for a ceasefire.
I think we need to discuss how to ensure peace in the region, and I don't think it's enough to say, let's have a ceasefire.
When the Supreme Court ruled yesterday that Colorado did not have the authority to remove Donald Trump from its ballot, it said it was working to avoid a patchwork of ballots where voters in some states got one candidate while voters in others did not. It could be chaos, the justices wrote. But did they, in fact, avoid potential chaos in their decision, or did they create another equally chaotic consequence? Politico's Josh Gerstein explores that in his latest piece. He joins me now. Josh, thanks for being here. I know you wrote this with Kyle Cheney. I'm going to give a shout out to him as well. Explain this loophole. Can you call it a loophole?
Well, it may be an unintended consequence of the court's ruling, Katie. I mean, you know, the question here is who has the power to kick insurrectionists off of the ballot, either the presidential ballot or a federal ballot, state ballot for any position. And it seems like no one is not a tenable answer. So the Supreme Court here had to basically decide whether states had the right to kick presidential candidates off the ballot. And they said no. They think that power resides with Congress, which is a fine answer, except for the fact that, Congress is also the one that, as we know from January 6th, oversees the tallying of electoral votes. And so our article is basically looking at a controversy going on in the last 24 hours among constitutional law professors, legal experts, who say that the court's ruling, sort of punting this to Congress, is almost an invitation to people up there to decide that they're going to unilaterally enforce this insurrection provision if they don't like the results at the ballot box in November.
So part of the decision, though, is that Congress would have to legislate. That's how I read it, at least. I'm sure there are legal scholars out there who are not going to read it that way. But if they have to pass legislation, a statute of some sort, is there something that Congress could already look to try to potentially say that if Donald Trump wins, he's not eligible and the election is moot?
Right. So, that is one interpretation of the decision. Some people say the Electoral Count Reform Act that was passed a couple years ago that was supposed to address the issues that came up 4 years ago in the tallying of the electoral ballots, that law could be seen as a law that implements this insurrection provision, even though it doesn't say that it is a law like that. But what's curious, Katie, is that the decision, at least the way I read it, is kind of ambiguous. It says Congress could pass legislation, but the majority doesn't actually say that that's the only way Congress can work its will. Curiously, the concurrence from the three liberals says that's what the majority said, but you can't actually find the words in there that legislation is required to implement this. Why would that be? Well, Congress on a number of occasions has considered denying positions either in the House or the Senate to people who were considered to be insurrectionists. And there's a general legal consensus that the House and the Senate each have the ability to do that. So there is some role for Congress to implement that 14th Amendment provision without passing legislation. They can do it with their own members. And the question is, could they do that in this electoral tally that's set to take place next January 6th?
I know you talked to a couple of lawmakers about this. What did they tell you?
Well, they generally said that they're going to look at this decision very carefully. I think that, Democrats were wary of saying right now that this is something that they'd consider. Their preference, obviously, on the Democratic side would be for Joe Biden to win a decisive victory where that this would not even be a question. But it does seem like at least some Democrats, perhaps those, that are on the left end of the party, would be reluctant to rule out any possibility if they really think Trump isn't qualified to be president, because there are many legal experts out there, both on the liberal side and even a few on the conservative side, saying that they think this argument has some weight. The real question on the table is, did the Supreme Court sort of slam the door shut on this and nail it shut, or is there still a little bit of wiggle room in that door?
Josh Gerstein, really good to have you. It's a big question right there. Appreciate it.
Right. Thank you, Katie.
And still ahead, what the UN says it found that offers proof that Israeli hostages were sexually assaulted by Hamas, and what Hamas is saying in response. Plus, what's going on in California, where a heated contest will determine who will take Senator Dianne Feinstein's seat. Jacob Sobroff joins us there. As we go to break, though, a look at voters in Denver on this Super Tuesday. In exclusive new reporting, NBC News found that Vice President Kamala Harris wanted to go a lot further in her criticism of Israel over the weekend, but her speech was toned down by the White House Security Council. Joining us now, senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and former Arab-Israeli negotiator Aaron David Miller. Do you read any significance into the fact that the Security Council wanted her to pull back on her comments?
Yeah, I do. And first of all, I think if the president wanted to deliver a tough message, particularly on the issue of humanitarian aid, and there is an area where he actually can pressure the Israelis, he should have delivered the message himself. Sometimes surrogates work, good cop, bad cop, but in this case, anything short of a message from the president along the lines that were reflected in the vice president's very tough remarks. And as you pointed out, Katie, they probably were tougher, and the NSC probably toned them down. I don't think at this point, given the fact that the administration really is pretty desperate, And you can understand why, for an Israel-Hamas deal, that Joe Biden wants to be in a position of going to, figuratively speaking, going to war with words with Benjamin Netanyahu. So it doesn't surprise me at all.
Ramadan is in a few days. The other day I asked a spokesperson for the Israeli government, Elan Levy, whether they're considering that and whether they want to be fighting on Ramadan. He said there have historically been a lot of battles on Ramadan throughout the Middle East, which leads me to believe, that that's not going to be an issue for the Israelis. Is it going to be an issue for the wider Arab world?
I think Hamas has a stake in alleviating pressure on the part of the civilian population of Gaza. And according to the reports from negotiations, part of their demands are to surge humanitarian assistance to allow Gazans who are now in southern Gaza to return to the north. And Hamas would also, I think, like to turn Ramadan, which is a festive occasion, into an opportunity to announce prisoner releases. So I think, in terms of Ramadan, I think that Hamas would like to see a deal. I think, though, that the more desperate the administration appears, the more intransigent Hamas's position is going to be. And worst thing in a negotiation is to tell your negotiating partners that you're more in a hurry to conclude a deal than they are. And I do believe it's resulted in Hamas toughening up its terms.
The UN found that there is evidence that women were sexually abused on October 7th, and that there could still be sexual abuse happening among the hostages who still remain now for more than 4 months in Gaza. Talk to me about the significance of the UN finding out and the tension between the UN and Israel.
I think from the standpoint of the Israeli government on this particular issue, and I don't think this is a matter of right or left, I think that Israelis have reached the conclusion that the international community is simply not as interested in this issue of sexual degradation and rape against the backdrop of the losses of civilian Palestinian life in Gaza. And the issue of sexual abuse should be given a more prominent role. And I think that the tussle with the UN, apparently the former Israeli foreign minister wanted a Security Council meeting in order to discuss this and blamed the UN Secretary General for not convening it. Well, it's not up to him to convene it anyway. It's the parties that have to do that. But I think there is this clear sense, farther away you got from October 7th, that the one split screen, which showed willful indiscriminate killing and sadistic treatment of women on October 7th, has now become one screen only. And that is what the Israelis are doing to Palestinian civilians in Gaza. And I think that that's an attitude, I think, shared by many Israelis, particularly as the UN itself confirms these abuses that occurred on October 7th. And the women who are in Hamas's hands or in the hands of other groups, I'm chilled to think of the stories that they are going to tell. Hopefully they're going to be released. But it's a reminder, Katie, I think, of what kind of organization we're dealing with here.
Yeah, you're not dealing with a government. You're dealing with a terrorist group. Aaron David Miller. Aaron, thank you very much. Coming up next, we are live in California, where voters are deciding who will fill the seat left vacant by the late Senator Dianne Feinstein. California's top two primary is today. 4 major candidates are in contention, and the top 2 will advance to the general, regardless of party. In theory, Democrats want the general to be between 2 liberals, but that is not likely to happen. Joining me to explain why one of the Democratic candidates is accusing another of propping up the Republican in the race is NBC News correspondent Jacob Sobroff. So, Jacob, what do you got for us?
What's up, Katie? As you know, California switched to, they began the transition to an all mail-in balloting process back in 2020 during the pandemic. What you're looking at, I was going to say what you're looking at is people processing those mail-in ballots. You're actually watching people come back from a lunch break, and then they're going to start processing the mail-in ballots again very shortly, within a matter of minutes, seconds, actually. This race is going to, first of all, in Orange County, this is central to this race because Orange County, as you know, was the bastion of Republican politics in California for a long time. That dynamic seems to be shifting. What's interesting about this race is all eyes for a long time, as we talked about yesterday, were on the Democratic candidates, on Adam Schiff, on Barbara Lee, on Katie Porter. But Steve Garvey, the former Los Angeles Dodger, has skyrocketed into the top tier of this race, largely based on the spending of Adam Schiff, surprisingly. You'd think he'd be spending on his own behalf. But because we have what's called a top two primary, where the top two vote getters go to the runoff, Adam Schiff's campaign strategy is to not face Katie Porter in the runoff, but instead to face Steve Garvey. So he's boosting Garvey with these ads. Katie Porter, as we talked about yesterday, has called that campaign brazenly cynical. Schiff is pushing back, saying, look, you're doing the same thing. The truth of the matter is, though, Katie, that Porter is not spending nearly the amount of money that Schiff is doing that type of tactic. When it's all said and done, it's going to be counted in a building just like this. This is one of the largest election jurisdictions in the entire country. And so we're going to be watching very closely. Be prepared. It could take up to 30 days to count the votes out of California. They do that deliberately. They do it slowly to make sure the results are fair and accurate. Katie?
Our most super correspondent on our most super Tuesday, Jacob Sobroff. Jacob, thank you very much. That's going to do it for me today. Deadline White House starts in just a moment.
Hi there, everyone. It's 4 o'clock in New York as we begin MSNBC's special coverage of Super Tuesday. Millions are headed to the polls in 16 states for what is the biggest day of voting, other than Election Day, of course, a moment after which Americans will have to face the fact that this is, in the words of a dear friend of this show, the do you want to have any more elections election, where voters are not just choosing between two candidates, but are making critical decisions about the very basic fundamentals of our democracy. If the polling and the results from the last few 2024 primaries show us anything, they show us that Donald Trump will defeat Nikki Haley by significant margins. And Super Tuesday will perhaps mark just days away from Trump clinching the Republican nomination officially. That means today will, if nothing else, crystallize the choice Americans face in November, not just between two presidents, one current, one former. One president who has an agenda that commands broad public support, whose commitment to our democracy and our institutions has never been in doubt, but who is dogged by some lackluster polling that doesn't match up with support for his policies. And the other, well, you know the other, that 4 times indicted, twice impeached ex-president who currently faces 91 felony counts in 4 jurisdictions. Someone who's been found liable for sexual abuse, who is set to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in penalties for years of financial fraud, who also makes no bones about his specific and concrete plans to rule as an autocrat, a, quote, dictator on day one if he's reelected, and whose tenure in office was marked by an endless series of low points, not just for the presidency, but for the country, each one more disgraceful than the one that preceded it. He seemed somehow to be in the rearview mirror for a lot of Americans. New York Times today asking this, quote, do Americans have a collective amnesia about Donald Trump? That story points out this, quote, more than 3 years of distance from the daily onslaught has faded, changed, and in some cases warped Americans' memories of events that at the time felt searing. In interviews, voters often have a hazy recall of one of the most tumultuous periods in modern politics. But as Trump pursues a return to power, the question of what exactly voters remember has rarely been more important. What comes next is, in the words of the most famous Haley Biden voter out there, quote, it's the snake oil salesperson versus the incumbent traditional politician. That quote was uttered by none other than investor and Dallas Mavericks owner Mark Cuban. He says he's voting for Nikki Haley today as a protest against Donald Trump. And regarding the Biden-Trump rematch, his choice is clear. He says this, quote, if they were having his last wake and it was him versus Trump, and he, Biden, was being given last rites, I would still vote for Joe Biden. Super Tuesday setting the stage for a showdown between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, an election where nothing less than our democracy is at stake, is where we begin today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. With me at the table for the hour, former senator and co-host of MSNBC's How to Win 2024 podcast, Claire McCaskill's back, and former Republican congressman and MSNBC political analyst David Jolly's here. David Jolly, there is something, I don't want to use the word ceremonial because there's nothing ceremonial about Donald Trump, but there is something significant about the milestone that we reach in a post-Super Tuesday point of the cycle.
Sure. He will not obtain enough delegates tonight to make him the nominee statistically, but the race is over after tonight. We know that. And so Donald Trump is cruising to a Republican nomination, likely, unless something unforeseen interferes with that, and a rematch with Joe Biden. And I think all eyes now turn to who are the Nikki Haley, Joe Biden voters.
Yeah.
Because very respectfully to the former South Carolina governor, she has never been competitive in this primary. This was the primary that never was.
Right.
But what she did do was mobilize a constituency, many of whom have said, I simply can't vote for Donald Trump. Now, a lot of them, perhaps Nikki Haley herself, will vote for Donald Trump. They'll fall in line. But what about those that won't? Because the Joe Biden coalition looks and feels different than a lot of Democratic coalitions of the past. It's the coalition we saw emerge in 18 and 20 and 22. It's the coalition that really led Biden to the nomination. I mean, Claire knows this better than anybody, but that was also a family conversation nomination where the party had to decide what direction are we going? Yeah. And Biden was the electable coalition. The Haley-Biden voter becomes everything when polls close tonight.
The Haley-Biden voter is going to be, and I can already hear our voters saying, no, you're going to spend too much attention on a tiny sliver. But the point is elections are decided by a tiny sliver.
Sure.
And in this instance, I think a lot of the Haley voters are women, or they're more female than the Trump voters, I think demographically. They've also accepted what Haley has been articulating, which is that Trump should be disqualified for some of the things that don't get, in my view, adequate airtime. Calling her Pelosi, mixing up Biden and Obama. I mean, she has gone after the thing. She's gone after Trump's own funny bone. Trump still walks around taking the mocha test everywhere he goes, man, woman, tomato, tamale. She has run against that in a way that no other politician ever tried to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Haley-Biden voters are important, no question. We know about 20% of the people who have voted for Haley have said they will not vote for Donald Trump under any circumstances. But also really important, Nicole, and we can't forget this, are the people who don't vote in these primaries, but will vote in November.
Right.
There is a huge number of voters that have never voted in a presidential primary or very infrequently vote in a presidential primary. But they do show up in November to vote. And it is those voters where Joe Biden has to be really careful. And listen, don't yell at me, everybody. I'm not saying that democracy is not on the ballot. But what I am saying is I think we have to be careful in talking in such generalities. Because people who will show up to vote in November that maybe won't vote in these primaries, they're not sitting around their kitchen table talking about saving democracy. They're talking about how much they paid for ground beef. They're talking about, by the way, they should be talking about the fact that gasoline is down to $3 a gallon from when it was $4 a gallon. They should be talking about the real wage increases that people have seen. They should be talking about that bridge that's getting built that they wanted to get built in their neighborhood for years. So I do think he's going to need to take this, not just to contrast to somebody who's crazy and demented and horrible integrity and character versus a really good man. But he also has to make sure he brings this down to a level that people can get their arms around easily instead of just saying democracy is on the ballot.
Yeah, and let me separate the Biden campaign from what we do here. I think they do that. And I think Josh Shapiro does that. And I think Governor Whitmer does it. I mean, I actually think there is a class of Democratic politicians who have become much better at marrying up the democracy questions that we grapple with day in and day out with their agendas.
Real stuff.
And I think President Biden does it very well. I think Governor Josh Shapiro does it the best. I think Governor Whitman does it the best. But I think that happens maybe outside of these conversations. Do you think you want to see more of it?
I do. And I think what they've got to do in these swing states, where we got to be honest, right now the polling's not great in all these swing states, and he has to win. And the third-party stuff complicates it even more. But in those states, he's got to figure out a way to make it as local as he possibly can, what he has gotten done. You know, whether it is actually having people from that state talk about their insulin's only $35 a month and what that means to their budget and what they can do for their families. They've got to do that on a granular basis in each one of these swing states to get those voters that are going to show up in November that probably aren't voting today.
And there's something that isn't democracy, that isn't granular, that is in the water now, that the Republicans can't walk back, and that is taking away a right to make decisions about your money. I mean, you step away for 3 months, and admittedly, you don't hear a lot of people talking about Jack Smith's filing for the gag order in the Chutkan trial. You do hear people, men, women, older Americans, younger Americans of all sort of socioeconomic persuasions at all sorts of, kinds of non-political gatherings talking about the fact that they don't want to live in a country where their sons or daughters can't have can't make a mistake and not have healthcare choices that are between a doctor and a patient.
Yeah, and I'm so glad Claire went there first.
Because it's always better when Claire goes there first.
Look, there's a healthy suspicion that the Biden camp has been relying on Donald Trump as the candidate to do a little bit of the work for them, to help close the gap. And Joe Biden has to do a couple things at the same time. He has to defend democracy, whether or not that informs voters' opinions or not. And I'm in Claire's camp. I don't think it informs a lot of voters' opinions today. But then he also has to take the role of a traditional president and candidate to say, this is what I've been doing for the country all along. And I think what ties those together is only in a healthy democracy are your fundamental rights protected. Only in a healthy democracy does an economy work for all people, are reproductive freedoms protected. Only in a healthy economy can we give equity to communities that Republicans want to punish. And I think part of that, and this is tactical as much as it is anything, Joe Biden and the Biden administration has to take control of the narratives that they're losing on. Don't avoid issues like the economy and the border. Own them and reframe them. Nicole, it is morning in America again. More people will go to work tomorrow than ever before.
Totally.
Home ownership is at historic highs. The stock market is breaking records. Retirement accounts are at an all-time high. Inflation's coming down, real wages are going up. Joe Biden has led a bipartisan border security package, and families have better access to health care and to education than they have ever had before. And so Republicans...
I want to bring out like an old-fashioned tape recorder and roll on this.
Listen.
I mean, have you told them this? I mean, that's it, right? I mean, I also, having come from Republican campaigns, think there is a place for the dark reality of the threat and danger of a second Trump presidency.
And the threat and danger is Republicans, instead of rooting against the economy and instead of rooting for chaos at the border, join us and try to fix it and try to move America forward. And you saw Joe Biden do that at the border last week.
Right.
He said to Donald Trump, come help me. And I suspect at the State of the Union address, we will see that again. This is a guy who played rope-a-dope with Rick Scott on Medicare last year. And if Republicans think they can just walk into this election making it about the economy and the border, it's up to Joe Biden to say, okay, let's talk about those issues because I've got something to say on it, too.
I want to add to our conversation my colleague, NBC News correspondent Ali Vitale. She's in Daniel Island, South Carolina, where Nikki Haley's campaign headquarters is just down the street from where she stands. Just give us the view from not just the candidate, but from her voters and supporters today.
First of all, Nicole, so happy to have you back and so happy you got time with baby. But you're back in time for Super Tuesday, which is the best part of this. And look, all quiet on the Daniel Island front here with the Nikki Haley campaign, at least for right now. We have been getting some color updates. For example, I heard from one campaign official just a few hours ago who said, look, we're putting on the vibe of being happy warriors right now. The ones that are around the headquarters are listening to music. Some of the tunes they're listening to are a little bit on the nose, including Started From the Bottom by Drake, as well as some very feminist-leaning tunes from Aretha Franklin and others. But that is very much the tone that they have taken over the course of the last few weeks of this campaign, too. They're aware that much of the Republican apparatus, as it exists behind Donald Trump, is trying to foot-tap them out of this race. And Haley has consistently put the brakes on that and said, hey, no, I am going to allow voters in at least the Super Tuesday states to have an alternative. They are looking at the results out of states like South Carolina and Michigan as, yes, Donald Trump victories, but also trying to say that for a quasi-incumbent like Trump, he should not be losing 40% on the ground roughly in South Carolina, 30% on the ground roughly in Michigan. Those are the reasons that Haley says she is staying in. For how long those reasons extend, I think, are really the ultimate question here that we're going to try to answer tonight, because in my conversations, Nicole, with the candidate and with the campaign, Super Tuesday is a clear inflection point for them. They have money on the airwaves here. They have staff on the ground. They've very pointedly said that Super Tuesday is a mile marker. But when I ask the campaign, okay, you've also got leadership slates and endorsers on the ground in Georgia, in Louisiana, that would take you through the end of the month. They just say that it's going to be step by step, in the candidate's words, after Super Tuesday. The fact that we're not seeing Haley tonight at all, at least at this point, I do think is notable. And the fact that my colleague Sarah Dean and I just moved some reporting calling some of those endorsers in Georgia that Haley's campaign manager often points us to when we ask, all right, should we read anything into the fact that you've got these guys? We called some of them, and they said there are no events planned at this point. Now, you've worked on campaigns. You know how quickly an event can be stood up. It could very well be that they get a phone call tomorrow and they're still off to the races. But at the same time, it could also be that this is the beginning of the end for Haley, depending on what those Super Tuesday results are.
You know, Allie, let me ask you, she has made a fitness argument against Donald Trump. She's not running a campaign, really. I mean, Christie ran a corruption and became the closest to running sort of a democracy rule of law campaign. Haley's been personal. She's called him unfit, not just to be president, but essentially to, you know, run a student council meeting. She's pointed out that he mixes up who she is with who Speaker Pelosi was. What are her options? You can't then go ahead and throw, certainly someone who served as an ambassador to the United Nations can't then throw her weight behind someone she has described as unfit. She'd be a laughingstock on the world stage, a place where she still cares very much what people think of her. What's she going to do?
Yeah. Well, look, she would say that this is not personal. And when we've asked her before, do you wish you had gone after the former president and her former boss sooner in this race? She said no, because then I would have been a Chris Christie. For Haley, and I do think that this argument doesn't track with the reality of the Republican world that we all live in, she says that this is not an anti-Trump campaign for her. But the reality is that if you are the only candidate left whose name is not Donald Trump, you are innately the non-Trump or anti-Trump candidate. That doesn't mean that Haley didn't vote for him twice, as she often says, but I do think it's difficult for her to come back into the fold and say in the same breath as she drops out of this race, if and when that happens, that she's endorsing the former president. She has said that he is in part, that he is too cute by half with Putin, commenting on the ways that he never said that Putin was responsible for Alexei Navalny's death. She's been critical of him on that front, on the world stage, as you point out. Of course, on his mental fitness and the ways that he's clearly mixing things up out on the campaign trail every once in a while. It's why I thought it was striking over the weekend when Haley said, basically, the RNC pledge was just a piece of paper. I'm going to make the decision that I want to make when the time comes about whether or not to endorse Donald Trump. I can tell you, I've talked to a few Haley supporters, and by a few, I mean a few dozen over the course of the last 5 to 7 states we've been in over the last 2 weeks. And they would be disappointed if she came out, by and large, and endorsed the former president immediately. This is a group of voters who I would say by a 2 or 3 to 1 margin, my unscientific numbers, don't want to see Trump as the nominee again, would struggle if he was in terms of what their decision in November would be. And I think that Haley is aware of what the vibe is on the ground in that sense. And that, I think, will inform her decision on whether or not to endorse, too.
Let me share with all of you what Mark Cuban had to say. And he falls in this category we're talking about. And I will confess, we may be spending too much time talking about them, but they matter with these margins as precariously close as they are. So Mark Cuban says this, quote, "It's the snake oil salesperson versus the incumbent traditional politician. One will tell you his snake oil will cure everything that ails you. The other will show you the details of his policies through charts, graphs, and statements. He is precise and methodical and wants to sell the steak," Cuban said of Biden, "not the sizzle. Trump voters are happy with their snake oil, whether it works or not." I mean, the thing about 2024 is that the fraud is the point. Trump is running, and that's why I think we're sort of post legal consequences for Trump, because his voters don't think any of it was real anymore. They're eating, it's like the line in American President. They're crawling through the sand, through the desert, and eating the sand, and they know it's sand, and they still want to eat it. How do you grab the Mark Cubans and turn them into a block that matters in November?
I think it's really hard. I think there are certain voters in this country that have been victimized by a very simple concept. If you lie boldly and frequently and repetitively, it will work. And that's what Trump has done. He has consistently sold lies.
Snake oil.
Snake oil.
Yeah.
And these people they're there. I mean, I talk to them in my state all the time, Nicole.
I'm sure.
They are just totally convinced that every prosecution against him is deep state. They're convinced that there was nothing wrong with J6, that was staged by the federal government. They are convinced that Donald Trump was wonderful when he was in office, did everything right.
What about calling active duty military losers and suckers?
You know, that's what's really bad. But what I'm saying is we need to quit fixating on those that are gone.
No, I agree about the Trump voters, but this is an interesting group that wouldn't have their hair on fire about a Nikki Haley presidency. Arguably, Nikki Haley came around to the reality about Trump after working for him, benefiting from that association, and taking a very long time in the primary to tell the truth about him.
Why?
That said,
why did she take so long?
Well, I think she had. I mean, I think she made a political calculation, and she's in there longer than Chris Christie, and so that's probably going to, you know, I don't. They're all going to lose to Trump. So I think if you can look in the mirror and be happy that you enabled him, that you propped him up, and that you took a long time to tell the truth about him, that's between you and your God, right?
Exactly.
You know, but that's what she did, and. You know, I think she becomes an interesting figure because there are voters that care about her, not so much because of the campaign she ran.
I agree. And I think she has an opportunity to make history here in a positive way if she doesn't fold like everybody else has folded.
Right.
Because this history's not going to be kind to this man.
Right.
You know, and just the border. I mean, going back to what David was talking about, if Biden takes it to Trump on the border, I was in the Senate when Trump was president, and he had said, I'm going to build a wall, Mexico's going to pay for it, I'm going to stop people at the border. He did none of that.
He did none of that. He did none of it. And he controlled all that. I remember till the day I die, Steve Schmidt sitting somewhere in a remote shot yelling, where are the pesos? None of what Trump promised his voters ever came to pass.
And he had the House, and he had the Senate, and he had the White House.
Correct.
And you know why he didn't do those things? Because Republicans in the Senate didn't want those. They knew they were stupid.
Yeah.
And some of them, anyway, were stupid. So
his ideas.
About what he was going to do. So what really Biden has to do, whether it's crime or whether it's the border or whether it's the economy, he's got to really take it to him and point out how many promises. Because really, those voters that are on the edge, on the bubble, they need to hear how many things Trump promised and didn't deliver on, how many lies he told that he was going to do, because he's going to do the same thing again.
Exactly. And I don't think they're on the bubble. I think he has to sort of, not the ones that think it was all great, but the ones that liked what they thought were ideas. It was all a lie.
I liked his policy.
Right. We still hear that.
I liked his policy.
Ali Vitale, it is very nice to see you, my friend. I have missed seeing your face and getting to talk to you. Thank you so much for starting us up today. The table sticks around. When we come back, we'll go to a polling site in North Carolina where Shaq Brewster is tracking a significant amount of Nikki Haley supporters, just what we're talking about. Are they more in line with Mark Cuban, who will turn into Biden voters next November? Plus, Donald Trump's alleged co-conspirator, Kenneth Chesebro, has a new problem. A whole new pile of evidence that the ex-president and his allies couldn't keep hidden from the public forever. But we're learning about the fake electors scheme and the dubious legal strategies that were always a cover for their political plots. We'll bring you that story and that brand new reporting from today's New York Times. And later in the broadcast, Steve Kornacki will be here at the board. He'll unpack our first round of exit polling, tell us what voters are telling us about how they feel about the country and their choices ahead of November. All those stories and more when MSNBC's Super Tuesday special coverage continues. Don't go anywhere.
What made you switch from Trump to Nikki Haley?
The man is a lunatic.
The stronger voice, which might be a little quieter, is Nikki Haley. It's the voice of reason, not the voice of treason.
Would you vote for Donald Trump in November?
I'm not sure. I don't know what to do. I'm hoping that somehow it works out that Nikki gets a nomination.
Because I think she's the best chance we have
right now, and I wanted to make sure that I will put out a vote against Donald Trump.
In a cycle so far lacking some suspense, they make up one of the great mysteries of the election cycle. When all is said and done, do the people who think Trump is a lunatic who committed treason, what do they end up doing? Will we look back at them and the things they said and call them swing voters this cycle? Few of the Nikki Haley supporters who've been interviewed by NBC News today across the country suggested that she was anything more than a long shot to win the Republican nomination. So the real question becomes, what do they do? Where do they end up if and when she leaves the race? Joining our coverage, NBC News correspondent Shaq Brewster in Greensboro, North Carolina. Claire and David are still with us. Shaq, tell us what you're hearing.
Well, Nicole, you know, one interesting thing to help answer that question, and one interesting factor, I should say, is that the people building Nikki Haley's support, it's a range of people. It's a coalition of voters. Some of them are people who voted for Joe Biden in 2020, who either were turned off by Donald Trump, but consider themselves Republicans and see Nikki Haley as a conduit for that energy. Others are traditional Republicans who just like Nikki Haley and will go back to Donald Trump if they need to in the general election. So when you ask the question of what happens to them after, it really depends on how they're entering that base of support for Nikki Haley. And I want you to listen to a couple of conversations I've been having with voters when I ask them that very point, not just who you're supporting and why, but what happens if you get that likely general election matchup. Why Nikki Haley?
Two reasons. One, I think she would do a very good job. And two, I think Donald Trump is a threat to the well-being of our country.
But if it's a Donald Trump, Joe Biden rematch, what do you do in that case?
Donald Trump.
What made you switch from Trump to Nikki Haley?
The man is a lunatic, and I think he's terrible for the country.
What are you thinking about when you say that?
Just that he lies, he cheats, he's bankrupted millions of businesses and people, and I don't see anything good about him.
Let me ask, if Donald Trump is the nominee in November, do you support Joe Biden over Donald Trump?
No.
What do you do?
I don't know. It will be a hard decision.
And that last conversation, her name was Monica, we went on a little bit longer, and I asked her, well, you know, what do you do? How do you ultimately make a decision? And she said she doesn't know. She'll wait it out. But then she did say that if Donald Trump chooses a vice presidential candidate that she likes, then that could swing her over and have her be a vote for Donald Trump, despite her thinking that Donald Trump is a lunatic in her words. So that just gives you a sense of how it's a difficult decision. Some of these voters don't genuinely say they don't know what they'll do if it gets to November and it's that Donald Trump-Joe Biden rematch. But you can bet, based on the conversations that I've been having at least, a lot of them will likely go back into the fold, will most likely go back to the Republican candidate and vote for Donald Trump, Nicole.
So interesting. And I would say, having worked on a lot of campaigns, if Trump's VP pick is decisive, it would be the first time in American political history that that's the case. I mean, and again, Shaq's a tremendous journalist. I'm sure that is what people are saying. But there's never been an instance where that's been, I mean, even all the lore around Palin, like, that's not where he lost. I mean, you know, I mean, there's... I feel like we're still talking about such small numbers and anecdotal pieces. The fundamental thing is that I think is so vital is that Trump's own voters know that he's a threat to the well-being of the country, that he's a terrible person, that he bankrupted, these are their quotes, that he's a lunatic, and that he committed, in their words, treason. That has seeped into a part of the sort of political spectrum that it was an open question for me.
That's right. And I think it's an important context to baseline. This focus on the Haley Biden voter is not the end-all, be-all. I mean, Joe Biden's a Democrat who has to marshal together a coalition largely of Democrats and Democratic-performing voters from the left to the right to the middle, the mainline Democrats, the progressives, the moderates, and so forth. However, this is not a mandate election we're going to in November. This will be a coalition election, and that's where the Haley Biden voter really does matter. And so if you're Nikki Haley, and more importantly, you're a Haley voter, You have built your campaign around questioning Donald Trump's fitness for office, around his competency, around his patriotism, his loyalty to the country. You've called him unhinged, unstable. You have said his election conspiracy theories are those of a loser. You have said that he sided with Putin. You have said he's not competent or young enough to be president. Donald Trump beating Nikki Haley tonight on Super Tuesday does not make Donald Trump more fit for office. And the question earlier about, so what changes the dynamic? It actually relies on leadership voices like Nikki Haley's and like Chris Christie's and Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger to say, we are voting for Joe Biden in November. Right. And if they fail to do that, they failed the greatest test they've ever faced, probably. The voters, many of the voters, are already ready to answer that question, that they'll vote for Joe Biden.
Well, and voters have to answer that question. They're going to go in a booth and there are going to be two things on the menu. And Liz Cheney has said on this program she won't vote for Donald Trump. Sue Gordon, former deputy DNI, said she wouldn't vote for anyone who adheres to Donald Trump's philosophy, which is essentially saying she wouldn't vote for Donald Trump. I mean, the not voting for Donald Trump has to become a clarion call about the fitness question.
About voting for Joe Biden, though, because very gratuitously, really gratuitously, kind of disgustingly, Nikki Haley has called Joe Biden more dangerous than Donald Trump. And when she was pressed on it...
We know she doesn't believe.
She brought up issues of corporate taxes and border policy, not threats to democracy, not existential threats to our individual rights and to the future of the country. And so do we see people who play in the space of, oh, I'll never vote for Donald Trump? Are they willing to say, it's a binary race and I'm going to vote for Joe Biden to protect the future of the country? Because thus far, that's where a lot of Republicans with conviction continue to stumble.
And we're talking about Republicans at our own peril, because the other piece of that and the other piece of winning is that it shouldn't be hard to vote for Joe Biden. It should be the easiest vote every Democrat has ever made. Because whatever you are chafing at the White House against, Donald Trump is in another universe of scary and bad.
Another universe. And the woman who told Shaq that she might vote for Trump if he picked the right vice president, I'll put money that he won't.
But even if he does, it's like, what's he going to do? Call him the P word again? I mean, like, how did it go for the last guy?
What she's looking for is for him to pick someone that would embody seriousness and normalcy, and he's going to pick a sycophant. He's going to pick somebody who's, oh, Donald Trump, you're the best, and you're so smart, and I don't notice that your face is orange, and your hair is too orange, and I don't notice the fact that you lie every day. That's who he's going to pick. Right. He's not going to pick somebody to bring people in. He's never been about building out. He's always been about bringing out the folks that are for him. So I do think that if Biden can, and here's the other thing to remember, and I kind of harping on this, but right now, the party identification is the lowest it's ever been in terms of Democrat and Republican. It is now just as many people identify as independents as the two parties. So we probably need to take a stroll down the road of, do any of these people end up with any of these third-party candidates?
It's going to be interesting. Our thanks to Shaq Brewster for his fantastic reporting. We are going to actually put all of these questions and theories to a member of the Biden campaign. Coming up in a little bit. Don't go anywhere. Up next for us, a cloud of confusion. Brand new evidence in the Trump coup plot shows how Trump allies started planning to overturn the election Trump lost just days after Election Day. What's next? It is exactly the kind of smoking gun evidence that was bound to come out eventually. Trump's bet is that by the time the wheels of justice ground over and over again and revealed that his deputies in the fake elector plot really did do what people worried they did, that we'd all be numb or distracted by other things. And frankly, only November's election will answer that question. But here is the evidence that the fake electors were always a scam and a sham and a political smokescreen, not an actual legal strategy. Two Trump lawyers, Kenneth Chesebro, now he has pleaded guilty in Georgia to crimes that are part of that felony conspiracy RICO case that's been charged, and Jim Trupis, another Trump lawyer, have settled a Wisconsin lawsuit over their alternate elector plot. As a part of that settlement, the lawyers turned over thousands of pages of documents, including text messages, emails, and photos that show the true intent behind the fake electors scheme. from the New York Times reporting on this story today, quote, through litigation, Mr. Chesebro said the Trump campaign could allege, quote, various systemic abuses and with court proceedings pending, encourage legislatures to appoint, quote, alternative pro-Trump electors that could be certified instead of the Biden electors chosen by the voters. Quote, at minimum, with such a cloud of confusion, no votes from Wisconsin and perhaps also Michigan and Pennsylvania should be counted, perhaps enough to throw the election to the House, Mr. Chesebro wrote to Mr. Trupis, referring to the swing states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And of course, we all know what they thought the House was going to do for them. This is stunning. Let's bring in the reporter whose byline is on this story, New York Times congressional reporter Luke Broadwater. This is amazing. I read this and then I read it again, and I was like, oh, of course we were going to get to this chapter in the coup plot, but here it all is in black and white.
Right, and you really see the origins of the scheme to overturn the election through these text messages and emails. I mean, it's literally one day after the Associated Press declares that Joe Biden has won the election that you see this first email come in which Ken Chesebro, who has since pleaded guilty to felony conspiracy, proposes this idea of creating this sort of sea of confusion that could be used to their advantage politically, to try to use politics to overturn the election rather than the actual votes of the voters. And then you see it go all the way through to Ken Chesebro himself there with the crowd on January 6th. And he's taking a picture of himself and he sends it to Jim Trupis, who first brings him into the Trump campaign with these ideas. And Trupis responds with, enjoy the history that you have made today, as he's standing there with the crowd right before the attack on the Capitol begins. So you can really see the through line all the way from this first idea being pitched to the violence that we saw on January 6th and how it resulted in that dark day in history.
I mean, Luke Broadwater, you also see that the House was always the plan. I mean, Trump said it to Donahue, quote, let my R defenders do the rest, end quote, when he was talking to DOJ about just declaring the election corrupt. But you see that the lawyers were just trying to get it to the House, and the House was always part of the plan of overthrowing an election that sent them back to the House. It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear if you read the emails and these text messages that the litigation was always sort of a subterfuge, that it was a distraction to try to get the end result, which was the overturning of the election. And so they're really looking at anything they could just to keep the courts in motion, to keep sort of a smokescreen going where they could achieve their political end, which was to keep Donald Trump in power. And a couple times they refer to that. You can see they really wanted litigation in Georgia. They thought that they could get litigation through Clarence Thomas up to the Supreme Court, and that would put special pressure on Mike Pence to agree with them on January 6th. And so they had all these theories and strategies, and it's really fascinating batch of emails that came out as a result of this settlement.
What's amazing, too, is their disdain for Mike Pence's refusal to go along with the coup. This is one of the texts from Chesebro to Trupis, the two Trump lawyers. Quote, I sketched what we had in mind for alternate electors of Pence, not opening envelopes. I detected no enthusiasm for any deviation from the ECA. I guess the Electoral Count Act. I now think Pence had decided by then not to do anything to press the envelope or create a test case, but decided not to be straight with the president. If he had been up front, Trump would have known he had no chance to win other than win in the courts or state legislatures before January 6th. If I'm right, Pence gave him false hope. Amazing that Pence is sort of who he is when they all were willing to throw him under the bus.
Yeah, and there is, in fact, some of those text messages you see where Chesebro he's actually taken the copies of the false slates of electors, and he's gotten them in the hands of a Republican congressman to try to get them over to Pence. And you can see he's expressing frustration that a Pence aide won't accept some of the slates of electors because the envelope's been opened, and so it would be improper. And he's insisting that the envelope's been sealed and everything's been done right. But you can tell in these texts that Pence really doesn't want to have anything to do with these false slates of electors, and they're really trying to hoist them onto him. And their frustration is very palpable in the messages.
So he's not here, but I'll give Andrew Weissman the last word in this conversation. He tweeted this: while Jack Smith's 2 Trump cases are effectively on hold, here's a thought. Instead of simply waiting on the Supreme Court and Judge Cannon, indict Cheesebro and the other unnamed, unindicted J6 conspirators in the D.C. federal case. We'll see. Luke Broadwater, thank you for this fantastic reporting and for spending some time with us to talk about it. Coming up for us, we'll turn back to politics. When the dust settles in the Republican primary, there will likely be one man standing between the White House and Donald J. Trump again, and that is President Joe Biden. We'll talk about the Biden campaign's strategy for denying the disgraced ex-president another term in office with a member of his campaign team. Next. Talk to Democratic voters or even a few Republican voters across our country, and you'll see one thing. There is a very real and tangible fear of losing our democracy. That fear is something that has not gone unnoticed by the smart people over at Biden campaign headquarters. They are banking that democracy will, as it was in the last election, continue to be top of mind for a significant chunk of voters in November. Joining our conversation about this very topic from Wilmington, Delaware, at the Biden campaign headquarters, Campaign Communications Director, a job I once held, Michael Tyler is here. How's it going?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
So we were talking about you, and we thought a couple hours ago, we appreciate you jumping on in short order. We should talk to you. Tell me what you're looking at and what you're going to be sifting through tomorrow after these Super Tuesday results come in.
Yeah, well, look, I think tonight is going to further cement what we've known has been a reality for some time now, right? And that's that this is going to be a general election between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And I think if you look at some of the trend lines, right, the question is who is on their front foot as we head into the general election. I think on all the metrics that really matter right now, it's Joe Biden who's on his front foot relative to Donald Trump. It's Joe Biden who's consolidating the Democratic base, while Donald Trump continues to struggle to expand beyond the hardcore MAGA base. If you look at the resources, it's Joe Biden who's amassing $130 million in his war chest, while Donald Trump continues to hawk shoes and pay off his legal fees. And most importantly, if you look at the agenda, it's Joe Biden who's running on a historic record of accomplishment that's incredibly popular with the American people versus Donald Trump, who's running on an agenda that's even more extreme than the last time he ran for office and held power. So as we kickstart the general election, as we go into the month of March, this campaign feels as though it's on its front foot with the voters who are going to decide the election.
I mean, extreme agenda is putting it politely. Donald Trump is running as a, quote, dictator on day one. Are you surprised the polls are close at all?
Well, listen, we're 8 months out from this election, and so not going to put too much stock into any one poll. Obviously, the Quinnipiac poll had Joe Biden up. There are other polls saying otherwise at this stage in the race. But for us right now, what matters is communicating relentlessly with the voters who are ultimately going to decide this election. And it's why we're looking into the data tonight to see where further targets might lie and make sure that we are talking about everything that's at stake. As you said, our very democracy is at stake. We have a candidate in Donald Trump who's pledging to serve as a dictator on day one, who's bragging about the role that he played in overturning Roe v. Wade, as we now see further implications of that playing out in states like Alabama, where access to fertility treatment is now at risk. And he's openly rooting for the economy to crash right now because he thinks it's going to help him politically. And so that's the fundamental choice and the stakes that we're communicating to the American people as folks wake up and realize that we are in a general election right now. You have somebody in Joe Biden who's waking up every day fighting for them, and somebody in Donald Trump who every single day is thinking about himself while he's running a campaign of revenge and retribution and threatening to tear down the very fabric of our democracy.
So question, first of all, I don't think enough has been talked about that Trump has had way more votes against him in these primaries than President Biden. You know, President Biden is dominating every primary contest in a way that Donald Trump would like to dominate, and he has not. My question to you is, how soon are you all going to move full staffs for groundwork in, what, the 12 or 13 states that are going to decide this election? Are they already there? How much of the campaign is going to be spent on that kind of groundwork? How much are you going to try to take this campaign locally to those states that are going to really make the difference once we vote the first Tuesday in November?
Yeah, that work has already begun in earnest in all the battleground states that are going to decide this election. And I think you could expect us to ramp up those efforts throughout the month of March and into the spring, because the work begins now, right? We have to do the work of building the grassroots army that's going to communicate with voters on the ground in every single state. We obviously need to communicate on the airwaves, but we also have to communicate digitally on all the platforms where voters consume their information. So those efforts began in earnest last year. We are now at the point in the race where you're scaling up those efforts, because to your point, this is a national election, but frankly, it's a series of statewide elections. So in the blue wall, in the Southwest, and the South, the states that are going to get us to 270, this campaign is aggressively ramping up its operations to meet the moment and confront the threat that poses us in Donald Trump.
Hey, Michael, David Jolly, Democrats and particularly Joe Biden have often polled pretty much upside down on the issue of border security against Republicans, and yet won elections. This race, they are really historically upside down, and we saw a new posture from the president after the bipartisan Senate bill on border security. Joe Biden said he would shut the border down. It was language we typically haven't heard from the president nor leading Democrats. To turn that issue around on Republicans, can we expect to see that Joe Biden going into November? Will the campaign spend money on that type of messaging on the border?
Well, listen, this issue is emblematic of the entirety of the choice facing the American people in November, right? You have a president in Joe Biden who is working to bring people together to actually solve the problem, to put solutions on the table. He said, bring me a bipartisan solution, right, that secures the border and helps fix our broken system, put it on my desk, and I'll sign it. And we were working towards that until Donald Trump came along and said, blow it up. He said, blame me, right, if this doesn't get through. Yeah. And he did that because he thinks it helps him politically. And that's the fundamental choice. That's true on border security and fixing our broken system. It's true on the economy. It's true on our fundamental rights and our freedoms as it relates to abortion. You have somebody in Joe Biden who's working to bring people together to actually solve problems. And you have Donald Trump, who is blowing things up, does not care the damage that he causes, the harm that he inflicts, so long as he's serving himself. So that's true on this issue. It's true on every issue facing the American people as we head towards November.
Michael Tyler, Communications Director for the Biden-Harris re-election campaign. Thank you for joining our conversation, even as it was underway. We're grateful to you. Look, I think some of your point in the beginning, getting on offense, a campaign does channel that more offensive. I mean, I liked what he said about being on the front foot. But there's a long, I guess, and there are many more days and many more news cycles to be waged. But there's a long way between a campaign footing and the perception of the voters. How do you read that?
Republicans, time after time, rely on negative partisanship. Democrats are awful, they're terrible, it's a bad economy, it's a bad border. In this case, you have one of the most productive administrations we've seen in recent history on all of those issues. And my point earlier was, don't fight on the Republicans' playing field, because you will lose, because the numbers are upside down. Crush their narrative with a message about what the Biden administration is doing. I think you see Michael right there perfectly on message, and I suspect we'll see the president at the State of the Union exactly the same.
Claire?
Yeah, I agree. And I think Thursday night is more important
than usual.
Yeah, me too. Because he has got to come out swinging. He has got to call out the Republicans for their failure to do anything.
You can hear it already, right? A whole bunch of man, you know.
And by the way, when they misbehave, you ought to call them out.
Which he did last time.
Yeah, this is what you've got. You've got people that want to scream but don't want to help the American people. And he's got a real opportunity Thursday night. I hope he takes advantage of it.
Yeah, it's so fun to watch these events with two people who have been in it, who have done it, and who know exactly what they're talking about.
Who had to sit through many State of the Union addresses in that chamber.
Well, who had to run? I mean, I think on Election Day, the only people that anybody should talk to are people who have actually had to stand before voters, because it's a whole different thing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here with me. Up next for us, MSNBC's Super Tuesday coverage continues. Don't go anywhere.
I love Joe Biden, and I think he's done a great job, but I do worry with his age. But, you know, given the alternative, Trump or Biden, there's 0% chance I'm ever voting for Trump. Like, it's either have democracy and a guy that's too old to run it, or democracy ends. Those are your choices.
That's one perspective for you. Hi again, everybody. It's now 5 o'clock in New York as we continue MSNBC's special coverage of Super Tuesday, an exciting day around here. We are watching democracy at work. It's never not thrilling. Americans in 16 states have been exercising their right to vote all day long, casting ballots for who they want to move forward to the general election contest and ultimately represent them or their parties in the coming year. But it's that exact right that hangs in the balance based on what happens next November. Polls begin closing 2 hours from right now, and Donald Trump is expected to handily defeat Nikki Haley in the Republican nominating contest, as he has been doing in recent Republican primaries, meaning he will, after tonight, be mere inches from officially clinching the Republican nomination after tonight's results roll in. That means the stage will very shortly be set for a rematch between Donald J. Trump and Joe Biden in November. It is a stark race, as stark a race as we have ever seen, where each candidate has made democracy, the lack thereof, a major pillar of their candidacies. President Joe Biden has stressed the importance of safeguarding our institutions and our country's free and fair elections, warning that we could lose them and our republic if he's not reelected. Which is not hyperbole. It's not a political message. It's the truth. As his likely 2024 opponent still hasn't conceded the last election, his 2020 defeat. Instead, spreading lies and distrust about the foundation of our democracy, our election systems. He's also said publicly that he wants to be a dictator, quote, on day one, end quote. For his part, President Joe Biden seems to already be treating the contest as though the general election is underway, where he's running against his predecessor, Donald Trump. Axios reports this on his strategy, quote, President Biden is privately pushing for a much more aggressive approach to 2024. Go for Donald Trump's jugular. Biden is convinced he'll rattle Trump if he taunts him daily. Biden has told friends he thinks Trump is wobbly, both intellectually and emotionally, and will explode if Biden mercilessly gigs and goads him. Quote, go haywire in public, as one advisor put it. Wow, that sounds fun. So we start the hour with Democratic strategist and director of the public policy program at Hunter College, Basil Smikle, is at the table. Writer-at-large for The Bulwark and MSNBC political analyst Tim Miller also at the table. What are you watching for tonight?
You know, one of the things that I want to see really is does Nikki Haley in some way, shape, or form get enough support to chip away at the narrative for Donald Trump that he can't be a general election candidate?
Inevitability, if that's in question, that's all he's got is the inertia.
That's all he's got. Listen, his support, as we know, is rock solid. Those whatever 30%, 40% that he's got, he's going to get that. But I'm looking for any narrative that Democrats can weave to say, look at how many people that you could have gotten but didn't because they don't want to see you in a general election. So that's really what I'm looking for tonight. Ultimately, he gets what he gets, and we're going to be set for that rematch. So I'm ready to go there.
What about Biden's plan to trigger him? I think that's the technical term for what we
Intellectually and emotionally wobbly. I love that. I think he's absolutely right. Look, during the Obama years, we talked about when they go low, we go high. I think that was it. Michelle Obama. I support her, but I never supported that. The Bronx.
Me neither. As an ex-Republican, I knew it would never work.
Well, the Bronx in me doesn't support that either. You got to hit them on the nose if the bully attacks, right? And so this is not the time to go high when they go low. This is a street fight. You don't bring a book or a knife to a gunfight. And I hate to use the violent terms, but the reality is, as you teased up, this is a fight for our democracy. So you've got to be strong. You've got to take it to the street. And yeah, if you believe that he is intellectually wobbly and immature and emotionally immature, bring that out, because you'll have it for all America to see, and then they make a decision after that.
Tim.
Can we just do a I can't believe we're here moment for a quick second before I tell you what I'm watching for? There's something about being here with Nicole that just makes me like, I've got to just have to do a quick rant. Like, it's crazy that we're here.
Look,
he's about to win every
correct
state on
again.
Super Tuesday.
Yeah.
3 years after the insurrection.
So here's what I looked up today. It was May 16th when he clinched the nomination in 2016, and that he's stronger 8 years later. after his debacle of it. You can't find one ex-national security advisor who was a national security person going in that came out thinking his presidency went well or was a good idea. Not John Bolton, not John Kelly, not Jim Mattis, I mean, it's amazing that he's now 2 months ahead of that schedule.
You also couldn't find one person if we had a time machine and you just were able to take them a photo of what happened on January 6th of Trump flags and Confederate flags and the Capitol and cops, and just give them one photo. And like, in 8 years, this will have happened and you'll be for it. You'll be for him again. Like, everybody would have said, come on, Tim, you guys have TDS, you never Trumpers, you have Trump derangement syndrome. I would never be for him after that. That's so crazy.
Sensitive when people said that. Now I'm like,
Yeah, sure. So anyway, we're sitting here tonight. I would love to tell you that I'm looking at the crosstabs and trying to see where Nikki Haley's strong and where she's weak, but it doesn't matter, right? Like, this is Trump's party. It's a cult. On the margins, those voters will matter in November, and we can talk about that, right? Like, I think that and what Nikki Haley does over the next few months is going to be very important, more important than what happens tonight, frankly, right? And whether she endorses him or not, et cetera. But tonight, at least at the presidential level, there are also a bunch of interesting primaries where MAGA candidates are running in the governor and House race. But at the presidential level, it's like, come on.
Did someone hang on one second? Did you tell me that Steve Kornacki's ready? Oh, okay. So this is the whole thing. This is the highlight of the night. We have our first look at the composition of today's electorate. Our first chance to talk to NBC News national political correspondent Steve Kornacki, who is, of course, as he will be all night long, at the big board with early exit poll data. Steve, what do you got?
Yeah, Nicole, I guess one thing to keep in mind here is there are only 3 states tonight where we're going to have exit polls. So most of the states that vote, we won't have exit polls for. But Virginia, North Carolina, and California, we have some exit poll data for. And secondly, if you've been watching the first couple of primaries here, there's always a disclaimer when we show you exit polls at this time of night or late afternoon, this early. This is the initial wave of exit polling results. There are more interviews that are going to be conducted that are going to go into this poll. The poll is sort of a work in progress. We're showing you a picture that's beginning to come into focus, but that picture is not yet fully in focus yet. So with those disclaimers, let's take a look right now at what we're finding in this initial wave of exit polls. I think one key question has been, what's the composition of the electorate in each state in terms of party identification? We're asking voters here, do you think of yourself as a Republican, as an independent, or as a Democrat? And the higher that non-Republican number's been, we've seen the better Nikki Haley's been doing. So in Virginia, in this initial wave, 60% calling themselves Republicans, 29 independent. There's a rounding here. That's why it's going to add up to 101 on your screen. And 12% calling themselves a Democrat. So it's about a 60-40 split, Republican, non-Republican. Now, one sort of metric to keep in mind here, one benchmark to keep in mind in what so far has been Nikki Haley's best state. That's New Hampshire. Remember, she got 43% of the vote in New Hampshire. The Republican, non-Republican split was literally 50-50. It was exactly split in half. Non-Republicans in New Hampshire made up half the electorate. Haley got 43% of the vote. It was still 11 points shy of Trump. He beat her by 11 points, but that was her best showing. It was 50% Republican and 50% non in New Hampshire. Here it's about 40% non-Republican. That is Virginia. Polls will close there at 7 o'clock Eastern time. Take a look now at North Carolina here. Same question. How do you think of yourself? What party? 62 Republican, 34 independent, 4 Democratic. And again, that's a 62-38 split. Context for that, 50-50 is the mix that so far has produced the best result for Nikki Haley in these primaries. One more we can show you, California. And the key on California is, this is a little complicated, so stay with me here. California is a closed primary. So you have to be a registered Republican to vote in this primary. But we're still asking the question, because people sometimes are registered with parties and they're kind of stuck there. They may not want to be there. They may have, forgotten to change their registration or something. So we're asking folks, you're a registered Republican, you're voting in this primary, but how do you think of yourself? Do you necessarily think of yourself as a Republican? And so that's what we see here in California. 66%, 2/3, say they think of themselves as a Republican, 32 independent, 1% Democratic. So basically a 2/3, 1/3 split in California. Again, the key there, this is very different than New Hampshire, South Carolina, Michigan, states we've already seen. It's very different than Virginia and North Carolina tonight. California is a closed primary state. So it's a massive state. And population-wise, there's a lot of folks in California, big, sprawling, metropolitan, suburban areas, a lot of areas in California that are demographically extremely favorable to Nikki Haley. But anyone who's an independent and anyone who's a Democrat in those areas, and that's a lot of voters in all those areas, can't vote in this primary. So this is just among registered Republicans. 2/3 think of themselves as Republicans. 1/3 think of themselves as non-Republicans. And again, the benchmark for Haley so far, the best number she's gotten in New Hampshire was 50-50. One other way of looking at these electorates, I think this has been a good way to compare state to state, just sort of the nature of the electorate in each state. We've been asking this question in the exit poll of Republican primary voters. Did Joe Biden legitimately win the election in 2020? And again, you're seeing variance state to state right here. So let's start in Virginia on that question. And it's a split here. 45% saying yes, Joe Biden legitimately won in 2020. 46% in this first wave of our exit poll saying no, Joe Biden didn't. Now, again, in the state that was best for Nikki Haley so far, and that is New Hampshire, 11-point loss, 43% of the vote. The percent who said in New Hampshire that Biden legitimately won in 2020 was 46%. So basically, what happened in New Hampshire on this question, right now at least, is what we're seeing in Virginia. What about the other two states where we're conducting exit polls here? North Carolina. Here you see a different result. It's 34% yes, 60% no. And again, that puts North Carolina on this question basically in the same bucket as South Carolina. In South Carolina, it was 36% who said Biden had won legitimately. Here in this first wave, 34% in North Carolina. And then let's go to California. And again, it's a little counterintuitive because when you just think of California as a whole, you think of a big, giant blue state, a lot of moderate Republicans, this sort of thing. Well, again, closed primary here. So the number in California is just 33%. That's actually the smallest number right now of the three states that we're polling on us. The most overwhelmingly Democratic state in this Republican universe, the smallest share who think that Biden legitimately won in 2020. So you see 33, 57, 10% expressing no opinion on this. Again, initial wave here. We'll have several more. And at 7 o'clock, Virginia polls close. Vermont polls close. 7:30, we're going to start getting North Carolina. And then 8 o'clock, we're going to get, they're start going to come in bunches every hour at 8 o'clock. So pretty soon here, less than 2 hours, the exit polls will be supplanted with the real polls, the votes.
Steve Kornacki, did you say that 60% of the self-identified Republicans are election deniers? They don't believe Joe Biden legitimately won in North Carolina?
In North Carolina, I think that, let's go back here. I'll get it exactly on the screen here. 60% in North Carolina said no. 34% said yes. Just by comparison, because I say this number's bounced around in different states. In Iowa, now remember, Iowa, a caucus state, so smaller turnout, but more of a sort of hardcore Republican base there. This number came in at 29% on this question. 29% in Iowa said Biden legitimately won in 2020. New Hampshire, you know, a primary, lots of independent participation, 46% said that Biden had won legitimately in 2020. And then in South Carolina, you know, where Haley got 40% of the vote, her home state, the number was 36%. So that's the context. Michigan, we didn't have exit polls for, by the way. That's why I'm not including Michigan here. But 29, 46, 36, the three we've seen so far. And in that context, you can put 34% here in North Carolina, 33% right now in California, and right now, at least in Virginia, 45%. So Virginia on par with New Hampshire. South Carolina is sort of on par with North Carolina. And honestly, the California numbers look a bit like the Iowa numbers, again, because it's that closed Republican primary.
I'm not sure what else you need to know. That's so riveting, and that's such important baseline information. I'm so glad we asked that question. I'm so happy to see you, Steve Kornacki. I know you have a long night. Thank you very much for starting it off with us. Joining us at the table, MSNBC National Affairs analyst John Heilman is in the house.
My dad, Wisconsin-born, moved to California in 1957, died in 2017.
I know.
Registered Republican his entire life. Voted for Richard Nixon, voted for Ronald Reagan. Thought Donald Trump was the worst thing that had ever happened in the Republican Party. That man, spinning in his grave right now over that California number. Someone who was registered Republican his whole life. The idea that there's only a third of Republicans in California
that believe our elections.
I mean, again, my dad does not spin in his grave very often, except for watching my personal comportment. But this, on political issues, he is surely spinning in his grave this evening.
So let me play this in sort of the spirit of that kind of Republican. This is a Nikki Haley voter talking about Trump. She's a pro-life, anti-abortion voter and anti-Trump.
What was the biggest factor in influencing your decision this time around?
Trying to put the message out that Donald Trump should not be leading the Republican Party. I mean, I can't say it enough. I think that he's a babe. His morals are completely misplaced, and someone who is paying off porn stars while his wife is at home pregnant, someone who has been found guilty of sexual assault should not be leading our country.
I don't know if I'm more surprised to hear it or that we don't hear it more.
Well, yeah, both. I mean, both honestly. And you know, it's, I mean, it's, you know, it tells you why. The other thing that this is talking about, one of the things Kornacki said, that talked about the cognitive dissonance around. And again, I want to go back to California, partly because, you know, we all have our various California. I don't know about you, but the other three of us have various connections in the state of California. People lived there, born there, went to school there, whatever. Yeah. I just, you know, you would listen to when I was out in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, you talk to Trump people, and they were, you know, when they would talk about their certainties about why they were going to be the nominee, and there was never any question about it. The whole thing has been a giant kabuki exercise for a whole year, but they would all point to California, and you would have that conversation all the time. I mean, that's as an illustrative example of what would happen when we got to the March primaries. You'd have more of these closed primaries, more of these winner-take-all primaries, and you know. But every time you'd hear someone say, "Well, California, you know, will put us, you know, this close to the nomination," it was always like that moment of cognitive dissonance of like how you think about California, how the country rightly thinks about California, and both as a blue state, but also what the California Republican Party has been traditionally, which has been, you know, the Arnold Schwarzenegger Republican, basically, you know, and it's just radically different now.
But it has in its DNA, the Pete Wilson anti-immigrant.
It does, and it's just
Orange County stuff.
Everything that's happened to the Republican Party under Trump was foretold.
Correct.
By the change in California republicanism in the course from the 70s into the 80s into the 90s and then into the century. But it really is now so fully. Right. You know, it is a third rump party now in California. It really is. There's the Democratic Party, there's independent, unaffiliated, and then there's this little tiny sliver of the relatively tiny sliver, it's the third most popular party, effectively, in California. But again, for Donald Trump, it's Ticket to Ride. Sorry?
So to speak.
I don't do this very often, but I want to show you something Laura Trump said. I can't even get it out without laughing.
Man, when's the last time you, are you going to play sound? When's the last time you called for Laura Trump's side?
That's why it's in the bottom of my file, because they're like, she'll never use this.
Put it on mark in your calendars, folks. This is a moment for history.
Well, let me play it. I'll explain myself afterward.
I can assure you there will be no funny business. Anyone who is not on board with seeing Donald Trump as the 47th president and America-loving patriots all the way down the ticket being supported by the RNC is welcome to leave, because we are not playing games and we have no time to waste. So we have to ensure that every single penny of every dollar donated goes to the causes people care about.
We're not playing games. It's literally all a game. The fake electors we learned in the New York Times, it was all a game. The whole thing is a game. We're patriots. This is the January 6th family.
Can we just do a little, just brief piece of semiotics? Like, what is that network? You might know. What is that?
Real America's Voice. I try to watch 1 hour of it a week. It's one of the core. Bannon's on it. Charlie Kirk's on it. It's a TV network. It's on DirecTV. Yeah, the whole thing for that video, though, it feels like either like Wayne's World or like Belarus or like a combo of it, right? Where it's like the daughter-in-law has now taken over the party, and she is demanding loyalty. And she's like, the daughter-in-law says, if you do not have full loyalty to my father-in-law, you're out.
Wasn't that a couple of years ago where you had all of those TV stations around the country reading that same disclaimer?
Yeah, Sinclair. It's the Sinclair thing. It's the same that echo thing. It's great because it says, candidate for RNC co-chair, the president's daughter-in-law. There's also a getter tag on there. Again, they're like, it's kind of all these It's like
the down market Truth Social.
It's like Swahili. These like the different language I understand.
But I played it after the Nikki Haley voter because even with, I mean, you know when North Korea launches the missiles and then we air the North Korean newscast where they're, I mean, even with the disinformation coming from the ex-president's daughter-in-law on one of their networks that I'm sure is wildly popular among the Trump base, you still have Nikki Haley voters. It's amazing that you have Nikki Haley voters who say this, who know that he was found liable for sexual assault, who know that he had sex with a porn star.
She could
yeah, it's amazing.
And you know, look, there was a report some time ago, and I love the wording of this because it says that what Donald Trump does has changed, has brought a lot of Republicans around to his worldview. And why does that resonated with me? Because it's not just about winning an election. It's about how he wants to reshape not only American politics, but global politics. Exactly. So when I see a video like that, I don't just think about Donald Trump because he's scary in and of himself. But he is not the ideology. The ideology is going to come from all of the people around him. Like, right? All the people around him that are going to be in the bureaucracy, moving the levers of political power and actually doing the work. So when I tell people, like, be careful because you may be able to dismiss Donald Trump, I don't know how, but you might, always think about the people around him because they're the ones that are actually going to be implementing this. And we used to be able to talk about Republicans in California and New York as being different than Republicans in the rest of the country. No longer, because he really has reshaped people's worldview. And if you're in New York and California, you are no longer immune to that.
What is the ideology? If you don't say Trumpism.
Oh, do we have Vaughn's voters? Do we have Vaughn's voters? I'll play it for you. It's strongmen are good. Right. Give Putin Ukraine. Yeah. Sometimes violence is necessary. We'll find it. I mean,
machismo.
But what it is something so, I think, offensive to voters like the woman we just played, that's the Nikki Haley voter, that it seems, and I know you've been on the shrinkage beat, it seems to be shrinking the Trump coalition.
I mean, Tim has heard me rant about this, but like one of the main things about going around was doing the first 3 early state primaries, which I love historically. I've done them all, love doing them, love. Most so depressing doing these, and for a million reasons, not just because Trump was going to win and what it said about the Republican Party or that it was a foregone conclusion, but just the lack of energy out in the world, the kind of flaccid, acquiescent tone of everybody out there. And really, I mean, that you hear about it a lot on the Democratic side, and it's true. There are a lot of Democrats who are not thrilled about Joe Biden, and they're like, okay, we'll go along, but we're not loving it. But it's this thing that's striking about it is more on the Republican side, because I say it over and over again. I get yelled at sometimes by the Trump base about this. Oh, they're everybody. We love him just as much as before. I'm like, guys, like, just the basic metrics. The yard signs aren't there, and the turnout at the rallies is not great. And yeah, he can still fill an arena, but only if he doesn't do an event in that state for a week, and then everybody gets the built-up energy, so they all show up. It's the Republican Party is the turnout numbers are a one. And his performance is one metric. But another metric is it matches perfectly the actual experience of seeing what it's like out there, which is that a lot of Trump voters, not the hardcore base that totally venerate him, but a lot of Trump voters who are like, yeah, I guess. I mean, I hate Joe Biden, so I guess we got to stick with this clown. And that's how it is out there. It's not, the Trump movement isn't what it once was, I will say.
I have to sneak in a quick break. Lucky for us, no one's going anywhere. And ahead for us, voters going to the polls in Alabama in the first election since the state's Supreme Court ruled that frozen embryos created during the IVF process are children and should be protected as such. It's a decision that is having a far-reaching impact on women and families, not just there, but nationwide. And today, what voters are saying about it as they cast their ballots. We'll have a live report next. And later, our series, American Autocracy, It Could Happen Here. And what happens when democracies backslide slowly into authoritarianism. Historian Tim Snyder will be our guest on what voters can expect when they elect a strong man, knowingly, and whether the 2024 election will decide whether we ever have elections in our country again. Scary thought. Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
The Supreme Court got it wrong, though.
You believe the Supreme Court, the embryo decision?
Why do you think they got it wrong?
Because they said embryos are humans.
From your perspective, do you view embryos as children?
Yes, I think so, yes. I think women or families should have control of their lives and their bodies, women in particular. They're interfering with people's lives and happiness. I don't think they got it right.
Voters today in Alabama having their say, going to the polls for Super Tuesday just weeks after the state Supreme Court made international news with the decision that holds that embryos are children. It has paused IVF treatment for women and their families in that state. The decision was devastating for Alabama women hoping to grow their families using IVF. It also created a political nightmare for Republicans from coast to coast. While some Alabama voters, as we just heard, may be split on what IVF is, nationally, voters are widely and overwhelmingly opposed to the Alabama Supreme Court's decision and its consequences. And like the Dobbs decision, that will continue to haunt Republicans at the ballot box come November. A new poll finds that 86% of all Americans support IVF access. Just 14% oppose it. Joining our coverage, NBC News correspondent, our friend Dasha Burns is with us in Montgomery, Alabama. Also joining us, senior opinion writer and columnist for the Boston Globe, MSNBC political analyst, our friend Kim Atkinstor is here. Dasha, tell me what you're hearing.
Well, Nicole, here's something I'm learning from voters as I'm talking to them today, and it's really fascinating because you're right, the vast majority of people support IVF. But there is a bit of a disconnect that I've heard in a lot of my conversations between what the state Supreme Court did, the ruling that embryos are children, and the impact on IVF treatment in the state. The fact that some clinics have had to pause treatment. Not everyone is connecting those dots. There are a couple of people I spoke to when I asked, do you agree with the Supreme Court? Do you agree that embryos are children? They confidently said, yes, absolutely. Life begins at conception, including frozen embryos. But then I asked, well, but do you believe people should have access to IVF? Another resounding, confident yes. And the contradiction and conflict between those two things isn't necessarily clear to voters. So while Democrats are hoping to use this issue to say, hey, look, all of the consequences of the fall of Roe that we warned about when we're talking about other reproductive freedoms, like, yeah, this is happening. Take a look at what's going on in Alabama. But I do think that Democrats are going to have to do a little bit more work, especially on this issue that's so complicated if you haven't gone through the IVF process yourself, to do more work to tie that together, tie the decision together with the threat to IVF, tie all of that back to the fall of Roe and the door that has opened to restricting other reproductive freedoms, and also tie that to the stakes in down ballot races like today. 5 of the 9 Supreme Court seats here in Alabama are on the ballot today, including the Chief Justice who put out this ruling, who put out in his opinion Bible verses. He has aged out of his seat. Can you believe it? Alabama has age limits for their Supreme Court justices. And so there are folks running to replace him. But it just puts a spotlight on the power that state Supreme Courts and state legislatures have as well. The state legislature right now is trying to sort of fix the problem that the Supreme Court created, trying to protect clinics from legal liability so that they can continue to operate. But boy, this is a mess. And voters find it messy, too, and some of them are still a little bit confused about what it all means.
I mean, Kim, we know from Dobbs that tragically Democrats won't have to do any work because women will start suffering. I mean, what IVF is a miracle and a prayer and a Hail Mary and a heartbreak and all these things that real women, like the real women that we see go through near death, almost dying of sepsis in the United States of America in 2023 because they can't access abortion health care, women will start to feel the consequences. And Democrats won't have to do any political messaging because real women's lives will be devastated. Families will be stalled and dreams will be put on hold because extreme Republicans can't get the hell out of women's uteruses. That's what this is all about. And it won't take long for voters to figure that out. And you can believe whatever you want to believe. Actually, I think the abortion issue now has more people supporting choice who are pro-life than at any point in our country's history. Because removing access to reproductive health care isn't about that anymore for Republicans. And I think IVF is heading in the same trajectory.
I think that's exactly right, Nicole. I think in Alabama, which is already a very conservative state, you have a very different set of exit polling for both voters there than in the rest of the country. Those dots will start being connected. And you said something very important there, which is reproductive healthcare, which is what I've been saying since the beginning, since before the Dobbs decision came down. We talk a lot about abortion access, which is something that definitely moved the needle in the past several elections since the Dobbs decision came down. But now we're seeing that cross this threshold, across from abortion access into access to birth control, into actual IVF, which is just a crucial tool for people who want to expand their families, and seeing the impact of that, I think that is going to reverberate. I think the fact that lawmakers in states and so far in Congress in Washington, D.C. have not closed that loophole completely, it's making people very aware of just how far their rights are. I think this is something tangible. We all know people, if not in our own families, who used IVF. It is something that is very tangible in a way that saving democracy is not necessarily, or in a way that the end of affirmative action isn't if it didn't apply to you personally. This is something that people understand. I think this is massively going to move the election in 2024 and in the future.
I mean, Dasha, I guess all the evidence we need to sort of bolster what Kim is saying is that even Donald Trump knows it. I saw him race out to the microphones and say we were very strongly for the IVF and the V and the F2. I mean, they have no idea what they've done, but they know exactly how screwed they are.
I think look, and there's a disconnect too. Sorry, Nicole.
No, go ahead.
There's a disconnect, too, between what's happening at the federal level with Trump really trying to push the party to moderate its own and its rhetoric on abortion, because he knows, we heard him talk about this, he blamed the 2022 midterms on the abortion messaging from some of the candidates that he himself endorsed. But at the same time as he's, reportedly looking at 16 weeks, trying to bring consensus, you've got states like Alabama, like Florida, that's looking at a personhood bill. You have states, their courts and their state legislatures that are very, very conservative, going the opposite direction, going to the right on this issue. So it's going to muddy the waters and make it a whole lot more difficult for Republicans at the federal level to say, hey, no, we don't disagree with what Alabama did, if there's example after example after example of red states pushing this issue further and further to the right.
I mean, Kim, the only reason abortion is illegal in the United States of America is because of Donald Trump. The sentence can end right there. I mean, the court did what it did because Donald Trump put them there to do this.
That's absolutely right. That and the decision to do that happened swiftly as soon as he got that third appointment. But in places like Alabama and elsewhere, where you have not just elected state lawmakers, but also elected judges, I believe that this is going to reverberate down the ballot as well. I believe you have judges who believe, like those in Alabama, that they have the constituency to rule as they did, and then they're going to realize that half of the electorate may see things very, very differently. So I expect that blowback to go down. Generally, I don't like the concept of elected judges, but I think what you're going to see is those elected judges hear from voters as well. I think this is an issue that can really change the complexion of elections up and down the ballot for quite some time.
Trump is still the leader of the Republican Party and has taken over the Republican Party in part because of the reptilian survival instinct. And on this issue, he's mostly repressed it, but it bursts out of the seams, right, when IVF gets overturned. And then he comes out and he says, we're strongly for it. And then when he diagnoses the losses in the midterms for the extreme views on abortion that have women in the United States of America dying of sepsis when they're pregnant and can't get health care, Donald Trump will try to run from this. And it is the Biden campaign's first, second, and third job to make sure he can't.
Absolutely. And he might get away with it, by the way, if they don't do it very well, right? Because Donald Trump reads to people, I think correctly, as somebody that doesn't care about abortion maybe paid for abortion. Who knows, right? But certainly it's not somebody that... Am I not allowed to say that on cable TV?
How dare you suggest such a thing?
I mean, his personal Vietnam was having sex with random women, so I'm just looking at the odds. That was his quote. Anyway, he doesn't read as somebody... He doesn't read like Mike Johnson, right? And so I think that there are voters out there who are lower info, you know, who he attracted, right? He attracted these people that are not Christian conservatives, right? That are blue-collar folks that used to be Democrats or attracted his coalition, that they don't want this. They don't want a strict abortion regime. And so it's up to the Democrats to educate those voters and make sure they know that actually weird, creepy Mike Johnson, you know, who wants to be in your bedroom. And he signed on to bills that are no abortions ever. Like week one, right? Like forget exceptions, forget, you know, and then you get into the IVF stuff, right? And so I think that voters are smart enough to get this message. If you can tell them, we saw this in the midterms, right? Where the Democrats did the worst actually was in blue states, where a lot of voters didn't feel the scare about the abort, right? Like in New York and California, a lot of these voters are like, abortion's not going to be banned here. Well, man, in 2024, it's a different story. Because if you have...
We're running on a national ban.
Right. If Donald Trump has full control of Congress and Mike Johnson is sending him an abortion ban, what's he going to do?
Right, because if you're in New York, you feel that you're going to get someone protected by the governor and the legislature of that state. But to Dasha's earlier point, and this is critical for me, because if you've got Republicans over decades trying to put judges in the right position, and then over that time trying to flip state legislatures, which they did, and Democrats lost 1,000 seats during the Obama years. So all of these decisions get pushed to the state, and now if you're a Republican, you cannot control what certain states are going to do. So you take something like what happened in Alabama, Democrats can now tie every Republican in the country to that decision and to many more, because the argument would be, look at what they did in Alabama, when does it stop? It doesn't stop. And there was the great quote with the woman at the top of the segment. She's talking about it as a function of personal freedom, right? That's a Republican talking point, but Democrats can now use that and flip that and say, look at how far the Republicans have gone to even impinge upon your personal freedoms. When has that happened? But it's happening now.
You get the quick last one.
I will just say, you know, it's Brother Scarborough reminded us this morning that as late as 1979, people talk about the beginning of the religious right and the transformation of American politics around abortion and sexual freedom as emanating from Roe v. Wade. Not true. So the Southern Baptist Convention was still pro-choice all the way until 1979. A political decision made by Paul Weyrich and Richard Viguerie and Jerry Falwell in 1979 was when it suddenly was like being pro-life is part of the religious of Christian evangelical conservatism, because they were dealing with a Christian evangelical president who was a Democrat named Jimmy Carter. This election in 2024.
And I would just add, and Bush 41 was still pro-choice.
Exactly. Yes, but Bush 41 was still pro-choice way back then. Yes. This is 79, right? That's a revolution happened in 1980 around making an issue that had never been politicized before in this way. There were religious people who were pro-life, for sure, but it wasn't like there was an alignment between the Republican Party, Christian conservatives on this issue. And I gotta say, that was our beginning of a long march and a big transformation in our politics. It is now, to me, increasingly looks like, when the history of this era is written, that this era post-Dobbs, and maybe this presidential election, is when we're gonna start to see that all of those coalitions and alignments unraveled 100%. And undone, and a new thing.
It's the biggest tectonic shift in our politics. It's huge. It's massive. All right, well, to be continued. Dasha Burns, Kim Eckenstore, John Heilman, Basil Smikle, Tim Miller, thank you so much for spending time with us on this Super Tuesday. When we come back, our series, American Autocracy, It Can Happen Here, continues. The very special guest, historian Tim Snyder, is here, who has written extensively on tyranny and authoritarianism around the world, his biggest fears about the potential, the possibility of a second Trump presidency, and why electing a strongman leader never, ever works out for the voters who put him in office. That is next.
He said tonight, quote, "It's nice to have a strong man running the country." What does that mean to you?
It means somebody that's got some backbone.
I believe that sometimes history calls for strong men to be strong leaders at key times in our history, and I think he would be perfect for the job.
Amen. It's something that is heard over and over again on the campaign trail at Trump events from Trump supporters today, right now. happening right now. This delusion that a strong man is a good thing. It might be what our country, our democracy actually needs right now. It's a talking point they're stealing from Donald Trump, who's constantly going on and on about his affinity for and admiration for the tools deployed by autocrats like Putin and Xi. Heck, this Friday he's having Hungary's strongman leader, Viktor Orban, over for dinner and a hang at Mar-a-Lago. But on this day of all days, when millions of Americans do the spectacular thing of taking time out of their day to go exercise their sacred right to vote, let's stop for a second and really have a conversation about what that means, what a strongman would mean for American life, even for those Trump voters, as we all know it. It's something we've been trying to stop and drill down on in our new series, American Autocracy. It could happen here. But it's a question that's been casting a shadow over every facet of American life since Trump first took power the first time. Back then, the idea of tyranny or autocracy would have any place in American civic life, or that their ideas would become popular in America, seemed unfathomable. And yet, the improbable and unfathomable overnight success of a teeny tiny pocket-sized book called On Tyranny by Professor Tim Snyder, even at the time, was prescient and suggested otherwise. On Tyranny identified links between fascism, past and present, anchored in lessons from the Holocaust and from Russian totalitarianism, and put Americans on notice that, yes, it could happen here. The New York Times likened On Tyranny to a medical pamphlet warning about an infectious disease, in this case, autocracy. Quote, read it carefully and be on the lookout for symptoms. That was in 2017, and now here we are, tracking those symptoms and searching for a remedy. Joining us now, Yale University history professor and author of the bestseller On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, Tim Snyder. I have to say thank you so much. It's a privilege to have you here today on a day when people are voting, and ask you if you thought it would come to this.
Well, I've always thought that it could come to this. You know, the only thing that stops it is when you're aware that it's possible. When you think you're special, when you think it can't happen, you're inviting it to happen. And we do have this candidate, this unusual person, who unfortunately is quite talented at bringing people along with him and making what did seem abnormal suddenly normal. So yeah, here we are.
Do you feel optimistic that we can get off of this path? Because when I asked Liz Cheney if there are other democracies that slide this far and avert that backslide into autocracy, she couldn't name one.
Yeah, Poland 2023, it does happen, and we have to believe that we can make it happen. I mean, I believe that we can make it happen. It depends on this election in November 2024. But making it happen will depend on people realizing that each of us has some role to play, however small. If we coast, if we depend on luck or history or our hunch or whatever it might be, we'll be facing something truly terrible, I think. So it can happen, but we've got a few months here to make it not happen.
I mean, and there's a humility in that, right? There's an arrogance in saying it can't happen here, and there's a humility in flipping that switch and saying it can, and so let's be vigilant. What is that sort of, and it seems like you're articulating a fork in the road for us. What does it look like if we take the path toward humility?
Towards humility. I mean, I like the word humility because it's our whole constitutional tradition. Our constitutional tradition is not built on the idea that Americans are different. It's built on the idea that America is a nation in the future which is going to be constructed according to rules, and those rules are going to take into account the fact that we're imperfect and are going to need to be checked and balanced all along the way, right? So I think things could get much better. I think if we get through this election and, you know, maybe one more midterm, I think things could get much better. The long-term trends, I think, are actually quite good for our country. It's a matter of getting through these next couple of years.
What are the danger signs? What do you sort of track every morning when you look at the health or lack thereof of our democracy?
I think the lack of honesty about what's at stake. the idea day to day that what we really should be thinking about is how tired we are or how old Joe Biden is or these essentially irrelevant things, rather than paying attention to the record of the Trump administration, the record of the Biden administration, the specific things that American citizens could do in the next 7 months to make a difference. That's what worries me. The talk, rather than the awareness of history and the clarity that one has to actually be out there doing something right now.
You know, it's interesting you make that point about history. I mean, Von Hilliard is my brilliant and gifted colleague who's out there and did some of those interviews. And when the Trump supporters talk about liking Putin and being fine with Putin's aims in Ukraine and just letting him have it, I asked her, I said, well, what do they think about the Cold War? Do they? I mean, it is this erasure of history and this erasure of the Holocaust and this willful ignorance of our place in the world. And I wonder how you deal with that in 8 months.
Well, in terms of the folks who think they want a strong man, I'm not honestly sure that big concepts or even historical references are the way to start. I think makes more sense to start with things like, you think this is going to be your strong man, but he's not going to be your strong man. He's going to be his own strong man. He's going to do whatever he wants. And once you realize that he's not yours, instead of feeling happy, you're going to be afraid because you know you can make a wrong move. And once you choose the strong man, there's no way back. You've burned that bridge behind you. This is not a menu at a restaurant. You don't get to make more choices. It's done. Once you burn this bridge, you get this guy or whoever follows him forever. And since you've voted not to vote anymore by voting for a strong man, you have to be aware that he has no reason anymore to pay attention to you. There's no connection to you anymore. You've got to be aware that his peers, the moment you anoint him, his peers are not going to be you, but other oligarchs and dictators around the world. He's not going to care about you. He's probably not even going to pretend to care about you after this. These are the basic logical things that I think people should probably be thinking about.
Tim Snyder, I'm going to put you on the spot on live TV and ask you if we can continue to call on you as we cover this moment in our country's history this year.
Absolutely. I'd be delighted.
Thank you so much for spending time with us on this day. We are grateful. A quick break for us. We'll be right back. This has been so fun, but our coverage is just getting started. Coming up at the top of the hour, Rachel Maddow, Steve Kornacki, and all of our MSNBC primetime friends and colleagues will take us through the night, through Super Tuesday, as the results start coming in. The first polls close in just over 1 hour. Quick break for us. Our special coverage continues after a quick break.